The dusty plains of ancient Anatolia, bathed in the golden light of an early morning sun around 8000 BCE, bore witness to an event that would alter the course of human history for millennia to come. In a small settlement nestled between rolling hills, a gathering of the most powerful shamans of primitive humanity convened in secret. Their faces, weathered by age and knowledge, reflected grim determination as they prepared for a ritual unprecedented in scope and ambition. These shamans, numbering perhaps in the hundreds, had foreseen a terrible future for mankind. Their psychic abilities, rudimentary compared to later psychers but potent nonetheless, had glimpsed the predatory entities that lurked in the immaterium, creatures that would later be known as demons. They understood that humanity's nascent psychic potential would eventually attract these predators, threatening the very soul of the species. The ritual they performed was both sacrifice and creation. In a single moment of collective will, these ancient psychers took their own lives, channeling their souls and psychic essence into a single vessel, a newborn child who would become known as the Emperor of Mankind. This account, while the most widely accepted theory of the Emperor's origin, remains shrouded in mystery, known only through fragments of ancient texts and the Emperor's own rare allusions to his past. The child born of this ritual appeared unremarkable to the uninitiated. Yet within him existed power beyond mortal comprehension, a perpetual, immortal, and imbued with psychic might that dwarfed anything seen before or since. The settlement that witnessed his birth would eventually be lost to time, buried beneath layers of civilization in what would later become part of Turkey. The Emperor's earliest years remain largely unknown, even to those few who would eventually learn fragments of his true nature. As civilizations rose across Terra, the being who would become the Emperor walked among humanity, observing and occasionally guiding. During the rise of Mesopotamian city-states, he studied the first codified laws of Hammurabi. In ancient Egypt, some accounts suggest he served as an advisor to pharaohs, guiding the construction of monuments that would endure for millennia. Always he remained in the shadows, his immortality requiring him to shift identities and locations regularly to avoid detection. Throughout these early millennia, the Emperor was not alone in his immortality. Other perpetuals, though far less powerful, also walked the ancient world. Alanius Person, perhaps the oldest of all perpetuals, had already lived for thousands of years before the Emperor's birth. Their paths crossed multiple times throughout history, sometimes as allies, other times as distant observers of the same pivotal events. Person, a simple man despite his immortality, often found himself at odds with the Emperor's grand visions, preferring to live among ordinary humans rather than shape their destiny. Urda, another significant perpetual, shared a complex relationship with the Emperor that spanned thousands of years. Her knowledge of genetic science would later prove crucial to the Emperor's greatest works. During the ancient period, their encounters were infrequent but significant, as both sought to understand the nature of their immortality and the potential futures of humanity. Unlike the Emperor, who often acted with clinical detachment in his plans for human advancement, Urda maintained a deeper emotional connection to humanity, a difference that would eventually lead to profound consequences. As classical antiquity dawned, the Emperor's influence became more deliberate. In ancient Greece, historical records hint at a mysterious figure who engaged with early philosophers, subtly guiding discussions on ethics, governance, and the nature of reality. Some scholars of imperial history believe the Emperor may have influenced Plato's concept of the philosopher king, perhaps seeing in it a reflection of his own future role. During this period, he carefully nurtured human philosophical development, recognizing that mankind's advancement required not just technological progress, but intellectual foundation. In the libraries of Alexandria, the Emperor preserved crucial knowledge, copying ancient texts before the Great Fire that would destroy so much of humanity's accumulated wisdom. His influence extended to early scientific developments, particularly in mathematics and astronomy, laying groundwork that would eventually contribute to humanity's reach for the stars. The fall of Rome marked a turning point in the Emperor's approach. As he watched the collapse of what had been the most advanced human civilization of its time, he recognized patterns that would repeat throughout human history, cycles of advancement and regression. This observation shaped his long-term planning, instilling a determination to eventually break humanity free from these cycles by uniting it under a single, eternal authority. Throughout the medieval period, the emperor's activities became more focused on scientific advancement. Working through proxies and assumed identities, he preserved ancient knowledge through the Dark Ages, establishing hidden repositories of learning that would later fuel the Renaissance. During this time, he occasionally encountered other perpetuals, including Aulanius Person, who had by then fought in countless human conflicts and grown increasingly weary of humanity's propensity for self-destruction. As the Renaissance bloomed across Europe, the emperor actively participated in the scientific revolution, possibly working alongside figures like Leonardo da Vinci and later Isaac Newton, guiding them toward discoveries that pushed the boundaries of human understanding. His influence was particularly notable in early studies of electricity and magnetism, fundamental forces that would eventually power humanity's technological ascension. The emperor's foresight extended beyond mere technological development. He recognized that humanity's future would be shaped by its social and political evolution as well. During the Enlightenment, he subtly influenced philosophical thought regarding governance and human rights, laying conceptual groundwork for the eventual unification of Terra under a single authority. By the 18th century, as the Industrial Revolution began transforming human society, the emperor had established a network of scientific facilities across Terra, working through front organizations and trusted human agents. These facilities conducted research far beyond the technological level of the time, developing early understanding of genetics, advanced materials, and energy systems that would not be officially discovered for centuries. The 20th century marked a crucial period in the emperor's preparations. As humanity split the atom and took its first tentative steps into space, the emperor recognized that mankind was approaching a critical juncture. He established more permanent bases of operation, particularly in the Himalayan region, where he could work with greater freedom away from the increasing surveillance capabilities of modern nations. During this period, his encounters with other perpetuals became more purposeful. Erda, whose genetic knowledge had grown to match or even exceed the emperor's in some areas, worked alongside him on early versions of what would eventually become the gene-seed technology. Their collaboration was productive but tense, as Erda increasingly questioned the emperor's willingness to view humanity as a tool for evolution rather than as individuals worthy of self-determination. The 21st century brought both promise and peril for humanity. As climate change, resource depletion, and political instability threatened civilization, the emperor worked to ensure that crucial technologies and knowledge would survive the coming upheavals. He foresaw that humanity would need to reach beyond Terra for its long-term survival and directed resources toward early space colonization efforts. The first human settlements on Mars and Luna in the 22nd and 23rd centuries bore his hidden influence, though few suspected the existence of an immortal guiding hand. As humanity expanded through the Sol system and developed the first warp drives in the 25th millennium, the emperor remained largely in the background, allowing human innovation to flourish while subtly directing it away from the most dangerous technological paths. The age of technology represented humanity's golden era, a time when human understanding of science reached its apex. The emperor observed as mankind spread across the stars, establishing colonies on thousands of worlds. During this period, he focused on studying the Immaterium more deeply, recognizing both its potential for human advancement and the terrible dangers it posed. His research facilities on Terra delved into the nature of psychic power, preparing for the day when human psychic potential would fully manifest. The development of the Men of Iron initially seemed to be humanity's crowning achievement, artificial intelligences that could handle the most complex tasks of civilization maintenance. The emperor, however, harbored deep reservations about entrusting humanity's future to thinking machines. These concerns proved prescient when the Men of Iron rebelled around the 25th millennium, turning against their human creators in a devastating war that destroyed countless worlds and killed billions. As the rebellion raged across human space, the emperor worked to preserve crucial technologies and knowledge on Terra. He foresaw that the aftermath would leave humanity vulnerable, and began consolidating power and resources for the long struggle ahead. The war against the Men of Iron left deep scars in the human psyche, creating a lasting distrust of artificial intelligence that would become codified in later imperial doctrine. The age of strife that followed brought even greater calamity. As human psykers began to manifest in increasing numbers across the galaxy, they became gateways for warp entities to enter real space. Worlds were consumed by demonic incursions, while others fell to anarchy as unprepared psykers lost control of their powers. Simultaneously, massive warp storms erupted throughout the galaxy, isolating human worlds from one another and making interstellar travel nearly impossible. On Terra, the Emperor witnessed the collapse of global civilization as warp storms cut the cradle of humanity off from its colonies. The planet descended into techno-barbarism, with former nations fracturing into warring states controlled by tyrants and warlords who hoarded the remaining advanced technology. Throughout this period, the Emperor continued his work in secret, gathering resources and allies while developing the technologies that would eventually allow him to unite Terra. The Himalayan facility, hidden from the wars that ravaged the surface, became the center of the Emperor's most crucial work, the development of the Primarch Project. Working with a small cadre of scientists, including some perpetuals, he began the painstaking process of creating genetically engineered superhumans who would serve as both his generals and his sons. This work represented the culmination of thousands of years of genetic research, combining human DNA with the Emperor's own genetic material and incorporating his understanding of the warp. Erda's involvement in this project was significant, her expertise proving invaluable in solving the complex genetic challenges involved. However, as the project progressed, she grew increasingly concerned about the Emperor's intentions for the Primarchs. Their disagreements intensified, with Erda advocating for the Primarchs to develop as individuals with free will, while the Emperor viewed them primarily as tools for humanity's salvation. As the Age of Strife continued, the Emperor refined his plans for humanity's future. He recognized that the species stood at a crossroads. It could continue its devolution into warring factions and eventually extinction, or it could be united under a single vision and guided toward its psychic evolution. The latter path was fraught with danger, as the emergence of a fully psychic human species would attract the attention of the Chaos Gods, but the Emperor saw no alternative if humanity was to survive. By the late 29th millennium, as the warp storms that had isolated Terra began to abate, the Emperor finalized his preparations. The Primarch Project neared completion, with 20 genetically perfect post-human generals growing in their gestation pods beneath the Himalayan complex. The Emperor had also begun development of the Space Marine Legions, using the Primarch's genetic material to create enhanced soldiers who would serve as the vanguard of his coming conquest. With Terra still fractured into warring techno-barbarian states, the Emperor knew that the first step in his grand plan would be the unification of humanity's birthworld. As the 30th millennium approached, he prepared to emerge from the shadows and take direct control of humanity's destiny for the first time in his long existence. The Age of Strife was ending, and the Age of the Imperium was about to begin. As the 30th millennium dawned, Terra bore little resemblance to the cradle of civilization it had once been. The once blue oceans had become toxic, irradiated sludge pools. Vast swathes of land lay barren, ravaged by nuclear fire and chemical weaponry. The skies, once clear and life-giving, now churned with acidic clouds that rarely parted to reveal the sun. This broken world had fractured into thousands of warring states ruled by techno-barbarians, gene cults, and warlords who fought endlessly over the dwindling resources and forgotten technologies of a once great civilization. It was into this shattered landscape that the Emperor emerged from his hidden Himalayan gene laboratories. No longer content to guide from the shadows, he had decided that direct intervention was necessary if humanity was to survive the trials ahead. The Emperor appeared not as a robed mystic or shadowy advisor, but as a conqueror, clad in Baroque power armor of gold and bronze that towered over ordinary men, wielding weapons of such advanced design that they seemed like magic to the techno-barbarians who first faced him. The Emperor's first campaigns were swift and decisive. From his initial stronghold in the Himalayan region, he he struck against the nearest techno-barbarian kingdoms with forces that, while small in number, possessed discipline and technology far beyond their adversaries. His earliest warriors were not the Astartes who would later become legendary, but genetically enhanced human soldiers who formed the core of what would become the Imperial Army. These troops were augmented by the first primitive battle robots and war machines reclaimed from Dark Age technologies. As territory fell under his control, the Emperor began to implement his more ambitious plans. In the gene forges beneath the Himalayan mountains, he commenced work on a new type of warrior, the Thunder Warriors. These proto-Astartes were massive, heavily muscled fighters who stood a full head taller than even the largest unaugmented humans. Their creation involved extensive genetic modification, organ implantation, and psycho-conditioning that transformed ordinary men into living weapons. The Thunder Warriors were magnificent but flawed creations. Each possessed strength that could tear apart armored warriors with their bare hands and resilience that allowed them to continue fighting even with grievous injuries. However, they suffered from genetic instability, shortened lifespans, and a tendency toward uncontrollable rage and mental deterioration. The Emperor knew they were temporary tools, a stepping stone toward the more perfect space marines he would later create. Organized into 20 battalions, each a few hundred warriors strong, the Thunder Warriors became the Emperor's shock troops. Their battle prowess was demonstrated most dramatically at the Battle of Mount Ararat, where a force of less than 300 Thunder Warriors obliterated a techno-barbarian army 30 times their number. Witnesses described the carnage as beyond comprehension, Thunder Warriors tearing through tank armor with power-gloved fists, shrugging off wounds that would kill ordinary men instantly, and fighting with a savagery that bordered on the inhuman. As news of these unstoppable warriors spread, some techno-barbarian realms chose to submit willingly rather than face annihilation. Others, particularly those ruled by gene cults who viewed the Emperor's genetic tampering as an affront to their own twisted ideologies, fought with fanatical determination. The High Brazil sovereignty, while not confirmed as the Emperor's starting point, was among the early major powers to fall to his forces, its gene-enhanced ruling class exterminated to the last member. The Ethnarchy, a vast territory spanning what had once been Eastern Europe and Western Asia, presented a different challenge. Ruled by a council of psychers who had maintained their power through a combination of warp sorcery and ancient technology, they initially attempted to negotiate with the Emperor. When diplomatic overtures failed, they unleashed weapons of terrible potency, including rad weapons that could kill even Thunder Warriors with lingering, painful deaths. The Emperor responded with overwhelming force, personally leading the assault on the Ethnarchy's capital citadel. Those who witnessed this battle spoke of the Emperor's own psychic might with awe, how he turned aside barrages of energy weapons with gestures, and struck down enemy psychers with golden lightning that erupted from his hands and eyes. The campaign against the Pan-Pacific Empire proved to be one of the most challenging of the unification wars. This technocratic state controlled vast territories across what had once been East Asia and the Pacific Islands, maintaining a large, well-equipped military force and a significant stockpile of Dark Age weapons. Their armies included their own gene-enhanced soldiers and combat servitors that could stand against Thunder Warriors, at least in sufficient numbers. The war lasted for nearly 3 decades, with brutal fighting across irradiated wastelands and fortress cities built into the sides of mountains. The Emperor demonstrated not just military might but strategic genius in this campaign, employing a divide-and-conquer approach that exploited internal divisions within the Pan-Pacific Empire's leadership. He targeted their food production facilities and water purification plants, forcing their population centers to surrender one by one. When the final Pan-Pacific stronghold fell, the Emperor ordered it razed completely, leaving nothing but a glass-smooth crater as a warning to those who might consider continued resistance. The Indonesian bloc presented a different sort of challenge. Ruled by Cardinal Tang, a figure whose cruelty was legendary even in an age of tyrants, the bloc maintained control through systematic terror and technological dominance. Tang's scientists had developed chemical weapons that could penetrate even Thunder Warrior physiology, and his armies employed combat stims that drove soldiers into berserker frenzies. The Emperor's forces suffered significant casualties in the early stages of this campaign, forcing him to develop new tactics and technologies. The solution came in the form of the first primitive Terminator armor, heavily shielded suits that could withstand even the most toxic environments. Equipped with these new protections, the Thunder Warriors spearheaded an assault on Tang's palace complex, a sprawling fortress that had once been Jakarta. The battle lasted 7 days, with Thunder Warriors fighting room to room through labyrinthine corridors filled with traps and automated defense systems. When Cardinal Tang was finally cornered, he detonated a nuclear device rather than face capture, but the Emperor had anticipated this move and had already withdrawn the bulk of his forces to a safe distance. As the Unification Wars progressed, the Emperor began to supplement his Thunder Warriors with other specialized forces. The Legio Custodes, though few in number, represented a quantum leap beyond even the Thunder Warriors in terms of genetic enhancement and combat ability. Each custodian was handcrafted by the Emperor himself, a unique work of genetic artistry rather than a mass-produced warrior. They served as his personal guard and as executors of his most crucial missions. The Officio Assassinorum also took shape during this period, beginning as small cadres of specially trained killers who eliminated enemy leadership through stealth and subterfuge. The Emperor recognized the value of targeted elimination alongside mass warfare, particularly when dealing with the gene cults and psyker cabals that could otherwise disappear into the population and emerge later to cause trouble. By the mid-30th millennium, approximately half of Terra had fallen under the Emperor's direct control. It was at this point that he began construction of the Imperial Palace on the site of the former Himalayan mountains. The initial structure was primarily functional, a fortress, command center, and research facility combined, but it contained the seeds of the vast complex that would eventually cover much of Asia. Beneath its foundations, the Emperor continued his most secret work, including the development of the Primarch project and the refinement of what would become Astartes' gene seed. The conquest of the Nordic reaches marked a turning point in the Unification Wars. This vast territory, encompassing what had once been Scandinavia and Northern Europe, was ruled by techno-barbarian clans who had maintained a higher level of technology than most. Their warriors wore power armor that, while crude by later imperial standards, made them formidable opponents. The Emperor deployed not just military might but also diplomatic skill, exploiting ancient rivalries between the clans and offering generous terms to those who submitted willingly. Some clan leaders were even permitted to maintain positions of authority under imperial oversight, setting a pattern that would later be repeated during the Great Crusade. As the Emperor's territory expanded, he began establishing the administrative framework that would eventually grow into the Adeptus Terra. The first imperial commanders were practical men and women, successful generals, administrators from conquered territories who had proven their competence, and techno-savants who could maintain the increasingly complex machinery of governance. Malcador the Sigillite, a figure whose origins remain obscure but whose loyalty to the Emperor was absolute, emerged as the Emperor's most trusted advisor and the architect of much of the early Imperium's bureaucratic structure. The final phase of Terran unification brought the Emperor into conflict with the Selenar gene cults of Luna. These organizations had maintained independence from Terran politics throughout the Age of Strife, protected by the void between worlds and their mastery of genetic science. The Emperor needed their knowledge and facilities to perfect the Astartes project, but the Selenites initially refused all diplomatic overtures, viewing the Emperor's genetic works as a threat to their own traditions. The Emperor's response was the first true void warfare campaign of the Unification era. Thunder Warriors, never designed for space combat, were supplemented by specialized void-adapted troops and early prototypes of what would become Space Marines. The battle for Luna was brief but devastating, with the Emperor's forces making surgical strikes against key Selenar facilities while avoiding the destruction of the gene labs themselves. Faced with inevitable defeat, most Selenar cults eventually submitted, agreeing to share their knowledge in exchange for limited autonomy. With Terra largely unified and Luna brought to compliance, the Emperor turned his attention to Mars. The Red Planet had weathered the Age of Strife differently than Terra, maintaining a higher level of technological knowledge through the religious organization known as the cult mechanicum. These tech priests worshipped the machine god, the Omnissiah, and had preserved much of the knowledge from humanity's golden age, albeit wrapped in religious dogma and ritual. Rather than attempting military conquest, which would have been costly and might have destroyed the very technological resources he sought, the emperor approached Mars diplomatically. He allowed the tech priests to identify him as the Omnissiah incarnate, the physical manifestation of their machine god. This claim was bolstered by the emperor's ability to understand and interact with ancient technology in ways that seemed miraculous even to the most knowledgeable Martian adepts. The Treaty of Mars, signed in the 30th millennium, formalized the alliance between the emperor's nascent imperium and the mechanicum. The treaty guaranteed Mars and its Forge worlds independence in internal affairs and the right to maintain their religious practices, while binding them to provide technological support, weapons, and war machines to the emperor's forces. This pragmatic arrangement, though it required the emperor to tolerate the tech priests' religious practices, secured the industrial and technological base that would make the coming Great Crusade possible. With the Treaty of Mars, the unification wars effectively concluded. The emperor stood as master of humanity's birthworld and its most important colony, with access to both the genetic knowledge of Luna and the technological prowess of Mars. Yet even as he consolidated these gains, the emperor was looking to the stars. The warp storms that had isolated Terra during the Age of Strife were abating, and for the first time in millennia, interstellar travel was becoming possible again. The Thunder Warriors, who had served as the Emperor's primary military force throughout the Unification Wars, had begun to show the fatal flaws in their design. Their genetic instability was accelerating, causing physical deterioration and mental instability. They had served their purpose, but they would not be the force that carried humanity's banner to the stars. That role would fall to the Emperor's new creation, the Legions Astartes, space marines designed using the genetic templates of the Primarchs. As the dust of the Unification Wars settled across Terra's scarred landscape, the Emperor began to assemble a council of extraordinary individuals who would help him transform his conquests into an interstellar empire. This inner circle, composed of beings with rare talents and unwavering loyalty, would become the foundation upon which the Imperium of Man would be built. Foremost among these advisors was Malkador the Sigillite, a figure whose true origins remained shrouded in mystery. Ancient beyond measure, though not immortal like the Emperor, Malkador possessed psychic abilities second only to the master of mankind himself. His weathered features and seemingly frail physique belied immense mental fortitude and political acumen. Malkador had served the Emperor since the earliest days of unification, managing the logistical challenges of conquering a world while simultaneously laying the groundwork for the administrative structures that would eventually govern thousands of planets. The Emperor entrusted Malkador with establishing the various institutions that would become the pillars of imperial governance. The foundations of what would later become the Administratum took shape under his guidance, with Malkador personally selecting the first Terran administrators based on merit rather than political connections. His organizational genius manifested in complex record-keeping systems and chains of command that could effectively manage resources across the entirety of unified Terra. Beyond administrative matters, Malkador also served as the Emperor's confidant in matters too sensitive or esoteric for others. His extensive knowledge of humanity's past, including historical periods that had been lost to most records, made him invaluable in the Emperor's long-term planning. Together, they would spend long hours in the Emperor's private sanctum, discussing the future of humanity and the threats that awaited in the void beyond Terra. While Malkador represented the civil and political arm of the Emperor's inner circle, Constantin Valdor embodied its martial aspect. As the first Captain General of the Legio Custodes, Valdor stood apart even from his superhuman brethren. Standing taller than even the Thunder Warriors, his physical perfection was matched only by his absolute dedication to the Emperor's protection. Valdor's creation had been a singular achievement in genetic engineering, his body and mind crafted through processes even more refined than those used for the later Primarchs. Under Valdor's leadership, the Custodian Guard evolved from a small cadre of bodyguards into a formidable military force in its own right. Each custodian was a masterpiece of the emperor's genetic craft, created individually rather than through the mass production methods that would later be used for space marines. Their golden armor, more advanced than anything else produced in that era, incorporated technologies recovered from Dark Age vaults and improved upon by the emperor himself. The training regimen Valdor established for the custodian guard emphasized not just martial prowess, but also intellectual development. Each custodian was expected to be a scholar as well as a warrior, studying everything from military strategy to philosophy and the sciences. This holistic approach created guardians who could protect the emperor not just from physical threats, but also from deception and manipulation. The relationship between the emperor and Valdor transcended that of master and servant. The captain general was perhaps the only being besides Malcador who was permitted to speak frankly to the emperor, occasionally questioning decisions when he felt it necessary. This privilege was never abused, as Valdor's loyalty remained absolute, but it reflected the trust the emperor placed in his judgment. As the emperor consolidated his rule over Terra, he recognized the need for a headquarters that would serve as both a practical command center and a symbolic seat of power. The construction of the imperial palace began in earnest, transforming the Himalayan mountains and the surrounding plateau into the greatest architectural achievement in human history. The initial structure was primarily utilitarian, focusing on defensive capabilities and functional spaces for the emerging imperial administration. Massive walls of adamantine and ceramite rose from the mountain bedrock, incorporating weapon systems capable of repelling any conceivable attack. Deep within these fortifications, the emperor established command bunkers where he and his inner circle could coordinate the governance of Terra and plan for the reconquest of the stars. Beneath the visible structures of the palace, an even more ambitious project took shape. The emperor expanded his gene laboratories, creating vast underground complexes where the most sensitive research could be conducted away from prying eyes. It was here that he continued refining the Primarch project and developing the gene seed that would be used to create the Space Marine Legions. These facilities incorporated technologies so advanced that even the Mechanicum adepts who helped construct them could not fully comprehend their function. At the heart of these subterranean complexes, the Emperor began construction of the Golden Throne. This device, ostensibly designed as a means to access and navigate the webway, represented the pinnacle of the Emperor's technological and psychic knowledge. Combining elements of Dark Age technology with esoteric warp engineering, the throne's true capabilities remain known only to the Emperor himself and perhaps Malcador. Workers involved in its construction reported experiencing strange dreams and visions, while psychers brought near it often fell unconscious or suffered seizures. The palace grew not just downward, but outward, gradually expanding to cover most of what had once been the Himalayan range. Great habitation spires rose alongside defensive bastions, providing living space for the countless administrators, servants, and military personnel required to maintain the emperor's growing empire. Processional avenues lined with statuary and triumphant monuments cut through the complex, designed to impress visitors with the majesty and power of the new imperial regime. As the palace took shape, the emperor formed another crucial element of his inner circle, the Silent Sisterhood. These women, all born with the pariah gene that rendered them soulless in the warp, were gathered from across Terra and organized into a formal institution under his direct authority. Their ability to nullify psychic phenomena made them invaluable in an age when uncontrolled psychers still posed a significant threat to stability. The Sisters of Silence, as they came to be known, established their fortress convent, the Somnus Citadel, within the expanding Imperial Palace complex. There, they developed training protocols and operational doctrines that combined their natural anti-psychic abilities with advanced combat techniques. Clad in golden armor similar to but distinct from that worn by the custodian guard, they became a striking and unsettling presence, their vow of silence adding to the aura of dread they projected. The Emperor recognized that the Sisters of Silence and the custodian guard complemented each other perfectly, one nullifying psychic threats, the other providing overwhelming physical protection. He formalized this relationship by establishing the talons of the emperor, an organizational structure that unified both groups under his direct command while maintaining their distinct identities and operational autonomy. This arrangement bypassed the traditional military hierarchy, ensuring that these elite forces remained loyal only to him and could act as a check against potential threats from within the emerging Imperium. Janisha Kroll, the first Knight Commander of the Silent Sisterhood, became a key member of the Emperor's inner circle in her own right. Though unable to speak, her tactical acumen and organizational skills impressed even Constantin Valdor. Together, they developed integrated combat doctrines that maximized the effectiveness of both their forces when deployed together. These tactics would later prove decisive during the early stages of the Great Crusade, particularly when confronting xeno-species with psychic capabilities. As the Emperor's dominion over Terra solidified, he turned his attention increasingly toward the stars. The warp storms that had isolated humanity's birthworld were subsiding, opening possibilities for interstellar travel once more. Preparations for what would become the Great Crusade accelerated, with resources from across Terra being channeled into the construction of warships and the training of armies. The gene laboratories beneath the Himalayan mountains became the center of the Emperor's most ambitious project, the creation of the Primarchs and the Space Marine legions that would be derived from their genetic material. 20 massive gestation pods, each containing a developing Primarch, were monitored constantly by the Emperor and his most trusted gene rights. Each Primarch represented a different aspect of the Emperor's own being, designed to embody specific traits that he deemed necessary for humanity's conquest of the galaxy. Simultaneously, the Emperor began the selection process for the first Space Marines. Young men from across Terra, chosen for specific genetic markers and psychological profiles, were brought to the palace to undergo the extensive surgeries and modifications that would transform them into transhuman warriors. The process was dangerous and many candidates did not survive, but those who emerged successful represented a new breed of soldier far superior to the Thunder Warriors who had unified Terra. The proto-legions began to take shape, each using gene seed derived from one of the Primarchs. Though the Primarchs themselves remained in their gestation chambers, their genetic legacy was already being implanted into the first generation of Astartes. Training facilities were established throughout the palace complex, where these new warriors could learn to use their enhanced bodies and master the advanced weaponry being produced by the forges of Mars. The Emperor's preparations extended beyond military matters. Recognizing that the Great Crusade would require not just conquest, but also incorporation of lost human worlds into a coherent political structure, he worked with Malcador to develop the principles and institutions that would govern the expanding Imperium. Legal codes, administrative procedures, and economic systems were established, creating a framework that could be adapted to newly compliant worlds. Communication systems capable of spanning interstellar distances were another priority. The Emperor directed the Mechanicum to develop a network of astropathic relays that could transmit messages through the warp, allowing for coordination across the vast distances the Crusade would cover. Specially trained psychers, their abilities carefully controlled and directed, would form the backbone of this communication system. The Navigators, a mutant strain of humanity with the unique ability to perceive the currents of the warp and guide ships through them, were brought under Imperial authority through a series of agreements with the Navigator houses. These ancient families, who had maintained their genetic mutation through careful breeding programs, were granted special privileges and protections in exchange for their exclusive service to the Imperium's fleets. As preparations for the Great Crusade neared completion, the Emperor's inner circle expanded to include military commanders who would lead the initial expeditionary fleets. Veterans of the Unification Wars who had demonstrated both tactical skill and administrative competence were elevated to positions of authority, given command of the warships being constructed in orbit around Terra and Mars. Throughout this period of intense preparation, the Emperor maintained a veil of secrecy around his most important projects. The existence of the Primarchs was known only to his closest advisors, while the true purpose of the Golden Throne remained the Emperor's secret alone. Even within the imperial palace, information was compartmentalized, with different departments and agencies knowing only what was necessary for their specific functions. This culture of secrecy, established during these formative years, would become a defining characteristic of the Imperium. The Emperor understood that knowledge could be as dangerous as any weapon, particularly when it concerned the warp and its corrupting influence. By controlling the flow of information, he sought to protect humanity from threats it was not yet ready to comprehend. With his inner circle established, the imperial palace taking shape, and the military forces of the nascent Imperium growing in strength, the Emperor stood poised to launch the greatest campaign of reconquest in human history. The stars awaited, and with them the scattered remnants of humanity that had survived the age of strife in isolation. The Great Crusade would reunite these lost colonies under the Emperor's banner, fulfilling the first stage of his grand vision for humanity's future. Deep beneath the sprawling imperial palace, in laboratories shielded by layers of psychically warded adamantium and technologies beyond the comprehension of even senior mechanicum adepts, the Emperor conducted his most ambitious genetic enterprise. The Primarch Project represented the pinnacle of his scientific and arcane knowledge, an attempt to create 20 superhuman generals who would lead humanity's reconquest of the stars. Each laboratory chamber housed advanced gene forges and incubation tanks filled with nutrient-rich amniotic fluid, their surfaces inscribed with microscopic hexagrammic wards. The Emperor had designed these facilities personally, incorporating safeguards against both physical intrusion and warp interference. Teams of gene wrights worked in shifts, monitoring the development of the Primarch embryos under the Emperor's direct supervision. These scientists, hand-selected for both their technical expertise and unwavering loyalty, understood only fragments of the overall project, a deliberate compartmentalization to protect the Emperor's most guarded secrets. The Primarchs were not simply larger, stronger versions of the Thunder Warriors or the nascent Astartes Legionaries. Each represented a different facet of the Emperor's own being, enhanced and specialized for specific purposes. Where the Thunder Warriors had been crude weapons, effective but unstable, the Primarchs were masterpieces of genetic artistry, their DNA sequences meticulously crafted gene by gene. Their physical capabilities would dwarf those of any human who had ever lived, with strength enough to tear apart tank armor, reflexes faster than the human eye could track, and intellectual capacity that could absorb and process information at staggering rates. Beyond their physical and mental attributes, the Emperor engineered each Primarch with unique talents. Some possessed innate tactical genius, able to process battlefield conditions and develop strategies in moments. Others demonstrated unparalleled diplomatic skills or technological intuition. These specializations were deliberately designed to complement one another, creating a command structure where each Primarch's strengths could offset the other's limitations. The Emperor did not work alone in this monumental undertaking. Erda, a perpetual whose knowledge of genetic science rivaled the Emperor's own, contributed significantly to the project's early stages. Her understanding of genetic stability and integration proved crucial in solving problems that had plagued earlier attempts at transhuman engineering. However, as the project progressed, Erda grew increasingly concerned about the Emperor's intentions for the Primarchs. Their disagreements intensified, with Erda arguing that the Primarchs deserved autonomy as sentient beings, while the Emperor maintained that they were tools created for humanity's salvation, albeit tools he would treat as sons. The physical development of the Primarchs was only one aspect of their creation. The Emperor also incorporated psychic imprinting into the process, instilling each with specific personality traits and predispositions. This psychic conditioning occurred at the deepest neurological level, shaping not just conscious thought but instinctive reactions and emotional responses. Through this process, the Emperor sought to create generals who would not just execute his orders, but internalize his vision for humanity and carry it forward of their own accord. This psychic imprinting varied between Primarchs. Some received stronger doses of the Emperor's martial aspects, predisposing them toward aggression and direct action. Others inherited his strategic patience or diplomatic acumen. These variations were deliberate, designed to create a leadership cadre with diverse approaches to the challenges of the Great Crusade. The Emperor understood that reconquering the galaxy would require more than just military might. It would need statesmen, scholars, and builders, as well as warriors. As the Primarchs developed in their gestation pods, the Emperor simultaneously laid the groundwork for the legions Astartes, the Space Marine legions that would serve as each Primarch's personal army. Using genetic material harvested from the developing Primarchs, he created 20 distinct gene seed templates, each carrying the unique attributes of its Primarch progenitor. These templates would be used to transform ordinary human recruits into transhuman warriors, creating a genetic link between each legion and its Primarch. The gene seed implantation process was refined through extensive trial and error. Early attempts resulted in high mortality rates, as the recruits' bodies rejected the foreign genetic material or suffered catastrophic mutations. The Emperor and his gene rights gradually improved the procedures, developing a standardized series of organ implantations that could be performed in stages, allowing the recruit's body to adapt incrementally to its transformation. Even with these refinements, the process remained dangerous, with only the most genetically compatible candidates surviving to become full Astartes. Each legion's gene seed carried specific traits derived from its Primarch. The warriors of what would become the 16th Legion developed enhanced aggression and resilience to injury, reflecting their Primarch's berserker tendencies. Those of the 13th Legion demonstrated exceptional discipline and organizational skills. The 15th Legion's Astartes developed psychic sensitivity far beyond that of other legions, mirroring their Primarch's prodigious psychic potential. These variations were not accidents but deliberate specializations, ensuring that each legion would excel in different aspects of warfare. As the Primarch project neared completion around the year 30,000, an event occurred that would alter the Emperor's plans irrevocably. The details of this catastrophe remain contested in imperial records, with multiple contradictory accounts existing even in sealed inquisitorial archives. What is known with certainty is that the gestation pods containing the infant Primarchs were breached, and the 20 superhuman children were cast into the warp, scattered across the galaxy. The most widely accepted explanation implicates the ruinous powers, the malevolent warp entities that would later be known as the Chaos Gods. These entities, perceiving the threat the Primarchs posed to their influence, created a warp rift within the heavily shielded laboratory complex. This explanation aligns with the Emperor's own statements in the aftermath, though he rarely spoke directly about the incident even to his closest advisors. Another account, suppressed in most imperial records but maintained in certain inquisitorial archives, suggests that Erda herself may have been responsible. According to this version, she acted to give the Primarchs freedom from what she saw as the Emperor's controlling influence, believing they deserved the chance to develop their own identities away from their creator's grand designs. This account remains highly controversial and is considered heretical by imperial authorities. Regardless of the cause, the consequences were immediate and severe. The Emperor's carefully laid plans for a coordinated great crusade led by 20 Primarchs commanding 20 legions were thrown into disarray. The infant Primarchs, still in their gestation capsules, were hurled through the warp to distant worlds across the galaxy. Each landed on a different planet, where they would grow to adulthood shaped by their adoptive cultures rather than the Emperor's direct guidance. The Emperor's reaction to this catastrophe demonstrated his unparalleled ability to adapt to changing circumstances. Rather than abandoning the Great Crusade or delaying until the Primarchs could be located, he accelerated the development of the Legion's Astartes. The gene seed harvested from the Primarchs before their disappearance provided sufficient material to begin creating Space Marines in larger numbers, though the process remained slower and more resource-intensive than the Emperor had initially planned. The Terran recruits who formed the first generation of each legion underwent their transformations without the guidance of their Primarchs. Instead, they were organized under the command of Legion Masters, exceptional Space Marines elevated to leadership positions based on their combat prowess and tactical acumen. These early legions developed their own distinct cultures and combat doctrines, influenced by the genetic predispositions inherited from their absent Primarchs, but shaped primarily by the Terran environments from which they recruited. Simultaneously, the Emperor directed resources toward locating the scattered Primarchs. Astropathic choirs scanned the warp for psychic signatures, matching the unique patterns of the Primarchs' minds. Navigator houses were commissioned to search specific sectors where warp disturbances had been detected around the time of the scattering. Even the Silent Sisterhood was deployed to investigate worlds where unusual phenomena had been reported, their null presence providing protection against potential warp-based deceptions. Despite these efforts, finding the Primarchs proved challenging. The galaxy was vast, and many human-settled worlds remained isolated behind warp storms or had regressed technologically during the Age of Strife. The Emperor recognized that locating all 20 Primarchs might take decades or even centuries, time that humanity could ill afford if it was to reclaim its place among the stars before new threats emerged. The loss of direct control over the Primarchs' development concerned the Emperor greatly. Each had been designed with specific psychological conditioning that would now be overwritten by their experiences on their adoptive worlds. Some might develop in ways that complemented their intended purposes, but others could potentially become antithetical to the Emperor's vision. This uncertainty necessitated contingency, planning on an unprecedented scale. One such contingency was the development of enhanced command protocols within the Legion's Astartes. The Emperor modified the gene seed to strengthen the bonds of loyalty between Space Marines and their eventually recovered Primarchs, ensuring that each legion would quickly accept its gene father's authority regardless of their prior command structure. This genetic predisposition toward loyalty would prove double-edged in later years, as it made the legions vulnerable to corruption if their Primarchs turned from the Emperor's path. Another contingency involved the creation of specialized units within each legion that embodied the purest expression of that legion's intended purpose. The destroyer squads of the Death Guard, the Raptors of the Raven Guard, and the Fire Drakes of the Salamanders all represented attempts to preserve the Emperor's original vision for each legion even without the guiding presence of its Primarch. These elite formations maintained training regimens and combat doctrines developed directly under the Emperor's supervision before the launch of the Great Crusade. The Emperor also established redundancies in the Imperial command structure. While the Primarchs would serve as his primary generals once recovered, he developed alternative leadership cadres that could fulfill similar functions if necessary. The Lord Commanders of the Imperial Army, the Fabricator General and his Archmagos cohort from Mars, and the nascent Council of Terra all represented parallel power structures that could potentially compensate for missing or compromised Primarchs. Despite these setbacks, the Emperor refused to delay the launch of the Great Crusade. By the year 30,000, the first expeditionary fleets departed the Sol system, carrying the earliest Space Marine legions to the stars. The Emperor himself led the largest of these fleets, commanding the Luna Wolves Legion directly while continuing to search for his scattered sons. Other fleets operated under the command of Legion Masters or trusted Imperial commanders, expanding outward from Terra in a carefully coordinated pattern of conquest and compliance. The Emperor's contingency planning proved prescient when the first Primarch was discovered within a few years of the Crusade's launch. Found on the war-torn world of Thonia, a planet in Terra's stellar vicinity, Horus became the first of the Emperor's sons to be reunited with his creator. Their meeting set the pattern for future recoveries. The Emperor recognized his son immediately despite the cultural differences imprinted by his upbringing, while Horus felt an instant connection to the being he somehow knew was his father. Horus quickly took command of the Luna Wolves, the legion created from his genetic template. The Emperor spent considerable time with this first-found son, personally instructing him in the arts of leadership and sharing details of his vision for humanity that few others were privy to. This close relationship established Horus as primus inter pares among his brothers, a status formalized when the Emperor eventually named him War Master and departed the Great Crusade to focus on other aspects of the Imperium's development. As more Primarchs were discovered on worlds across the galaxy, each reunion followed a similar pattern. The Emperor would recognize his son, explain his true nature and purpose, and grant him command of his legion. Each Primarch brought with him the cultural influences of his adoptive world, introducing new combat doctrines, organizational structures, and even terminology to his legion. The Terran veterans who had formed the original core of each legion sometimes struggled to adapt to these changes, creating tension that the Emperor monitored carefully for signs of potential discord. The Emperor's genetic craftsmanship proved its worth, as each recovered Primarch quickly demonstrated mastery of warfare on an interstellar scale. Despite their disparate upbringings, the inherent capabilities the Emperor had engineered into them allowed them to command vast forces with unprecedented effectiveness. Worlds that had resisted compliance for years fell within days when faced with a Primarch-led assault. Alien empires that had once seemed formidable opponents were systematically dismantled by the strategic brilliance of these transhuman generals. The Emperor's vision for the Legion's Astartes extended far beyond merely creating enhanced soldiers. Each legion was designed as a unique military force with distinct capabilities, combat doctrines, and cultural identities. While the Primarchs would eventually shape their legions according to their own preferences, the initial founding of each legion occurred on Terra under the Emperor's direct supervision, establishing foundational characteristics that would persist even after the Primarchs took command. The gene seed used to create the first Space Marines was derived directly from the Primarchs' genetic material, harvested before their mysterious disappearance. This biological connection created an inherent compatibility between each legion and its corresponding Primarch, though none could have predicted how profound this bond would become. The Emperor's gene rights established 20 distinct production lines, each dedicated to a specific legion's gene seed, operating from heavily secured facilities beneath the Himalayan mountains. Recruitment for the legions began with selecting appropriate candidates from Terra's population. The criteria were stringent. Potential Astartes needed to be male, adolescent, and possess specific genetic markers that indicated compatibility with the gene seed. The earliest recruits came primarily from the regions that had most readily accepted the Emperor's rule during the Unification Wars. The warlike tribes of the Urals contributed many warriors to the First Legion, while the nomadic plainsmen of what had once been Central Asia formed the core of the Fifth Legion. The savage fighters from the Rad Wastes of Albia became the foundation of the Eighth Legion, their natural brutality enhanced by the gene seed of their absent Primarch. The implantation process itself was a harrowing ordeal that many candidates did not survive. Each aspirant underwent a series of surgical procedures over several years, during which the 19 gene seed organs were implanted sequentially. The process began with the secondary heart and os medulla, which strengthened the skeleton and cardiovascular system enough to withstand the stress of subsequent implantations. Later procedures added organs like the Laramans organ, which enabled rapid wound clotting, and the catalepsian node, which allowed Marines to function with minimal sleep. The most crucial implantation was that of the progenitor glands, organs that would mature within the Space Marine and eventually be harvested to create new gene seed. Each Marine carried 2 such glands, one in the neck and one in the chest, representing the Legion's future ability to replenish its numbers. The Emperor designed this system to make the Legion self-sustaining, capable of continuing their genetic line without requiring his direct intervention after the initial founding. As the first generation of Space Marines completed their transformations, distinct differences between the legions became apparent. These variations stemmed from the unique genetic templates of each Primarch and manifested in both physical characteristics and psychological tendencies. The warriors of the Sixth Legion developed enhanced senses, particularly acute hearing and smell, making them peerless trackers. The Third Legion's Astartes displayed flawless physical precision and heightened sensitivity to sensory input. Marines of the 14th Legion demonstrated extraordinary resilience to toxins and disease, able to fight effectively in environments that would incapacitate even other Astartes. Some gene seed lines proved more stable than others. The 13th Legion's gene seed showed remarkable consistency, with low rejection rates and minimal mutation across successive generations. In contrast, the 9th Legion's implantation process frequently triggered neurological side effects, causing visual processing abnormalities that the Legion's apothecaries struggled to mitigate. The 15th Legion's gene seed produced an unusually high percentage of psychers, creating additional challenges for screening and training recruits. Training regimens for the nascent legions reflected their genetic predispositions. The 7th Legion, with its enhanced capacity for analyzing structural weaknesses, received extensive instruction in siege warfare and fortification. The 5th Legion, naturally predisposed toward rapid strikes and hit-and-run tactics, trained in mounted combat and lightning assaults. The 1st Legion, designed as the Emperor's prototype, underwent the most comprehensive training of all, mastering multiple warfare disciplines to serve as his adaptable instrument. Cultural indoctrination accompanied physical training, with each legion developing traditions that reflected their intended role in the Great Crusade. The 4th Legion embraced a utilitarian ethos focused on resource efficiency and technological mastery. The 10th Legion cultivated a meritocratic warrior culture where advancement depended solely on battlefield performance. The 17th Legion adopted philosophical principles based on self-sacrifice and the protection of civilian populations. These cultural foundations, established before the Primarch's discovery, would later merge with the traditions of their Primarch's homeworlds to create the distinctive identities of the fully realized legions. Initial legion structure followed standardized patterns developed by the Emperor and Malcador. Each legion was divided into chapters of roughly 1,000 Marines, which were further subdivided into companies, then into squads of 10 Marines. Command hierarchies placed a legion master at the apex, supported by chapter masters, captains, and sergeants. This organizational framework provided clarity during the early Great Crusade, though many legions would later modify these structures to suit their Primarch's preferences. The Emperor personally oversaw the development of specialized units within each legion. The destroyers of the Death Guard employed rad weapons and phosphex, making them experts in toxic warfare. The Moritat of the Raven Guard operated as solo assassins, targeting enemy leadership with preternatural stealth. The Pyroclasts of the Salamanders mastered Prometheum-based weapons, becoming unparalleled experts in flame warfare. These elite formations represented the purest expression of each legion's combat doctrine as envisioned by the Emperor. Weapons and equipment for the legions came primarily from Mars, following the Treaty of Olympus Mons. The Mechanicum's forges produced the iconic power armor that became synonymous with the Astartes, initially the Mark II Crusade pattern, followed by iterative improvements as the Great Crusade progressed. Each legion received standardized armaments including bolters, chainswords, and combat knives, though they quickly began developing specialized equipment suited to their particular fighting styles. The psychological conditioning of Space Marines represented perhaps the most crucial aspect of their creation. The Emperor designed the Astartes to be warriors without fear, capable of facing any horror without hesitation. This required extensive hypno-indoctrination and chemical treatments to suppress normal human emotional responses while enhancing aggression, loyalty, and determination. The process created soldiers of unparalleled devotion who viewed death in the Emperor's service as the ultimate honor. As the legions grew in size and complexity, the Emperor established support structures to maintain their effectiveness. Apothecaries trained in the specialized medicine required for transhuman physiology. Tech Marines studied with the Mechanicum on Mars, learning the maintenance rituals for power armor and other Astartes equipment. Chaplains emerged to tend to the spiritual needs of the legions, preserving morale and enforcing ideological conformity. These specialized roles ensured that the legions could operate independently for extended periods during the Great Crusade. The Thunder Warriors, who had served as the Emperor's primary military force during the Unification Wars, presented a complex problem as the legion's Astartes rose to prominence. These earlier gene-enhanced warriors suffered from increasing physical and mental deterioration, their unstable physiology breaking down as they aged. Their aggression, once directed against the Emperor's enemies, became increasingly difficult to control. Furthermore, they represented an outdated technology, crude prototypes compared to the more refined Astartes. The official historical record states that the Thunder Warriors died gloriously at the Battle of Mount Ararat, spending their lives to secure final victory in the Unification Wars. The truth, known only to the Emperor's innermost circle, was far darker. The Thunder Warriors were systematically eliminated in a planned purge, executed by the Legio Custodes and possibly elements of the earliest Space Marine legions. This ruthless action, while morally questionable, reflected the Emperor's pragmatic approach to achieving his larger goals for humanity. The few Thunder Warriors who escaped this purge became fugitives, hiding in the underhives and rad wastes of Terra while fighting their inevitable genetic degradation. Some sought ways to stabilize their conditions through stolen gene tech, while others sold their services as mercenaries to various factions. These survivors represented a loose end in the Emperor's carefully orchestrated plans, though their small numbers and deteriorating health limited the threat they posed to the nascent Imperium. With the Thunder Warriors removed and the Space Marine legions growing in strength, the Emperor finalized preparations for the Great Crusade. Initial expeditionary fleets departed Terra around the year 30,000, marking the beginning of humanity's reconquest of the stars. The Emperor personally led the largest fleet, accompanied by the Luna Wolves Legion, which would later be renamed the Sons of Horus after their Primarch took command. As the Great Crusade expanded outward from Terra, the legions operated primarily under the leadership of their legion masters, exceptional space marines who commanded in the absence of their primarchs. These early leaders established combat doctrines and organizational structures based on their understanding of their legion's inherent strengths. The Warhounds excelled at close-quarters shock assaults under their legion master Ibrahim Jihrir. The Iron Warriors became siege specialists under the command of Legion Master Barban Falk. The Ultramarines developed their disciplined, combined arms approach under Gren Visatho. The discovery of the first Primarchs dramatically altered the development trajectory of their respective legions. When Horus took command of the Luna Wolves, he immediately recognized the potential for more flexible tactical approaches than the straightforward shock assaults they had previously favored. Under his guidance, the Legion developed the Speartip attack strategy, concentrating elite forces at a single point to decapitate enemy command structures. This approach proved devastatingly effective and was soon emulated by other legions. Roboute Guilliman's reunion with the Ultramarines brought even more profound changes. The organizational genius of Guilliman revolutionized the 13th Legion's structure, replacing the standard formation with a more adaptable system built around independent battle companies. His codification of tactical doctrines in the Principia Bellicosa provided a framework that maximized the Legion's operational efficiency. These innovations spread throughout the Great Crusade as other commanders recognized their effectiveness. Rogel Dorn brought to the Imperial Fists an unyielding sense of duty and expertise in defensive warfare that transformed a legion already known for its stubbornness into the Emperor's preeminent siege specialists. Under Dorn's leadership, the 7th Legion refined its fortification techniques and developed new approaches to breaking enemy strongholds. Their reputation for resolute determination grew to the point where some compliance actions ended with mere word of the Imperial Fists approach. Ferrus Manus found in the Iron Hands a legion already inclined toward his mechanistic philosophy. The Medusan Primarch accelerated their adoption of bionic augmentation, establishing the doctrine that flesh is weak and should be replaced with more reliable mechanical components. This approach created natural affinity between the 10th Legion and the Mechanicum forces that often fought alongside them during the Great Crusade. The galaxy held its breath as the first Imperial warships broke orbit from Terra, approximately in the year 798 of the 30th millennium. Massive void vessels, their hulls adorned with the nascent Aquila and lightning bolt iconography, pushed into the darkness beyond the Sol system. The Emperor stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Bucephalus, a vessel of such immense proportions that it dwarfed even the mighty battle barges of the Space Marine legions. His golden armor caught the light of distant stars as he gazed out at the void, the weight of humanity's future resting upon his transhuman shoulders. The Great Crusade represented the most ambitious military campaign in human history. Its purpose was nothing less than the reunification of mankind's scattered colonies, the reclamation of lost technology, and the establishment of human dominance over the galaxy. The Emperor had spent decades preparing for this moment, gathering resources, building fleets, and creating the transhuman warriors who would serve as the vanguard of his reconquest. the early expeditionary fleets departed in a carefully planned sequence, each assigned specific vectors of expansion. The largest, led by the emperor himself and accompanied by the Luna Wolves Legion, drove outward along the Segmentum Solar's central corridor. Other fleets, commanded by trusted legion masters and lord commanders of the Imperial Army, pushed into the galactic east and north. This coordinated deployment allowed the nascent Imperium to expand rapidly along multiple fronts, maximizing the efficiency of their conquest. The Emperor's approach to bringing human worlds back into the Imperial fold demonstrated remarkable pragmatism. Each encountered civilization received a standardized diplomatic overture, an invitation to rejoin the human family under Terra's leadership. The terms were straightforward: accept Imperial compliance, contribute resources and manpower to the Great Crusade, adopt Imperial truth as the guiding philosophy, and maintain loyalty to the Emperor. In return, these worlds would receive protection, technological advancement, and participation in humanity's manifest destiny among the stars. Many isolated human colonies welcomed the Imperial expeditionary fleets with celebration. These worlds, having endured millennia of isolation during the Age of Strife, saw the Emperor's forces as saviors. On Sebastus IV, the population lined the streets as Imperial army regiments marched into their capital city, throwing flowers and weeping with joy. The compliance of such worlds required little more than formal ceremonies and the establishment of administrative structures to integrate them into the Imperium. Other human civilizations proved more resistant. Some had developed cultural or religious practices that conflicted with the Imperial truth's secular rationalism. Others had established ruling classes unwilling to surrender their autonomy to distant Terra. The Emperor authorized a graduated response to such resistance, beginning with extended diplomatic negotiations and cultural integration efforts. Imperial iterators, skilled orators and diplomats would spend months or even years explaining the benefits of compliance and addressing local concerns. When diplomacy failed, the Emperor employed more forceful methods. The initial phase typically involved displays of overwhelming military might, massive fleet deployments, and parade ground formations of Space Marines and Imperial Army regiments. These demonstrations often convinced resistant leadership to reconsider their position without bloodshed. The compliance of Terrach Prime exemplified this approach, with its ruling council surrendering after witnessing a single company of Luna Wolves performing combat drills outside their capital. For those human worlds that remained defiant despite these measures, the Emperor reluctantly authorized military action. Such campaigns followed strict protocols designed to minimize civilian casualties while swiftly eliminating resistance. Space Marine legions would target military infrastructure and leadership compounds with precision strikes, while Imperial Army forces secured population centers. The Emperor's directive was clear: these were misguided human brothers and sisters to be brought back to the fold, not enemies to be exterminated. The early expeditionary fleets achieved remarkable success rates in bringing human worlds to compliance. Historical records indicate that approximately 80% of human colonies encountered during the first decade of the Great Crusade joined the Imperium peacefully or with minimal resistance. This efficiency allowed the Crusade to expand rapidly, with the number of compliant worlds growing from dozens to hundreds within just a few years. The 12th Expeditionary Fleet, commanded by Lord Commander Primus Thaddeus Fabian and supported by elements of the 9th Legion, exemplified the early Crusades' approach to compliance actions. Operating in what would later be designated the Ultima Segmentum, this fleet specialized in bringing isolated human worlds into compliance through cultural integration. Fabian's diplomatic corps included not just military officers, but historians, artists, and educators who worked to bridge cultural gaps between Terra and long-separated colonies. The 4th Expeditionary Fleet developed a different specialty under the leadership of Legion Master Barban Falk of the Iron Warriors. This fleet focused on human worlds that had regressed technologically but retained valuable industrial infrastructure. Iron Warriors forces would secure these worlds' manufacturing centers intact, allowing Mechanicum adepts to quickly restore production capabilities. Within months, formerly primitive worlds would begin contributing tanks, void ships, and weapons to the Great Crusade's ever-expanding arsenal. The 8th Expeditionary Fleet, led by the Emperor himself during the Crusade's early years, tackled the most challenging compliance actions. Worlds with advanced technology or particularly entrenched resistance were reserved for this fleet, whose overwhelming force could quickly overcome any opposition. The compliance of Melchior, a system whose human population had extensively modified themselves with Xeno's technology, demonstrated the Emperor's resolve. After refusing multiple diplomatic overtures, Melchior faced the full might of the Luna Wolves Legion, resulting in compliance within 3 days of combat operations. As the Great Crusade pushed beyond the immediate stellar vicinity of Sol, it encountered increasing numbers of Xeno civilizations. The Emperor's policy toward non-human species proved considerably less flexible than his approach to human worlds. Alien civilizations that posed any potential threat to human expansion were systematically eliminated, their technologies studied by the Mechanicum before destruction, their worlds cleansed and repopulated with human colonists. The Orcs presented the most persistent Xenos threat during the early Great Crusade. These green-skinned warriors had established crude empires throughout the galaxy during the Age of Strife, taking advantage of humanity's absence to claim formerly human worlds. The Emperor personally led several anti-Orc campaigns, developing specialized tactics that would later become standard Imperial procedure. At the Battle of Goro, the Emperor and a contingent of custodians faced the Orc warlord known as Erlak Erg, with the Emperor personally destroying the massive greenskin in single combat. The Luna Wolves proved particularly effective against Orc holdings, developing the Speardip, assault doctrine that would become their trademark. This approach involved concentrating elite units at a single point in the enemy formation, driving directly toward command elements to decapitate the Orc leadership. Without their leaders, Orc forces typically fragmented into disorganized mobs that could be eliminated piecemeal by supporting Imperial army regiments. The Rangdan Xenocides represented a darker chapter in the early Great Crusade. Beginning around the year 827, the 30th millennium, this series of campaigns against the technologically advanced Rangdan species tested the Imperium's military capabilities like nothing before. The Xenos employed devastating weaponry and infiltration tactics that caused substantial Imperial casualties. The Emperor committed significant forces to this conflict, including the First Legion, which suffered such heavy losses that much of its early history was effectively erased. Details of the Rangdan Xenocides remain heavily redacted in Imperial records, with some information accessible only to those with the highest clearance levels. What is known is that the Emperor eventually authorized the use of weapons of mass destruction to contain the Rangdan threat, including virus bombs and early examples of cyclonic torpedoes. The affected regions required extensive quarantine measures for decades afterward, with some worlds declared permanently uninhabitable. Throughout these early campaigns, the Emperor maintained a parallel project of immense significance, his work on the human webway. This ambitious undertaking aimed to create a human version of the Eldar webway, a network of tunnels through the Immaterium that would allow for instantaneous travel without exposure to the warp's dangers. The Emperor envisioned this as the next stage in human evolution, freedom from reliance on warp travel and its inherent risks. The Golden Throne, installed in the deepest vaults beneath the Imperial Palace, served as the linchpin of this project. This massive psychic amplifier, constructed using technology that blended Dark Age science with the Emperor's unique understanding of the warp, would allow him to breach the barriers between real space and the webway, creating access points that human engineers could then stabilize and expand. Work on the webway project progressed in absolute secrecy, known only to the Emperor's most trusted advisors. Even the Primarchs, as they were discovered and brought into the Imperial fold, remained unaware of this aspect of their father's work. The Emperor recognized that the webway represented humanity's best hope for long-term survival in a galaxy increasingly threatened by warp predation, but he also understood that premature knowledge of its existence could attract unwanted attention from entities within the Immaterium. As the Great Crusade expanded outward, the Emperor continued to search for his scattered Primarchs. The discovery of Horus on Thonia marked a turning point, providing proof that the Primarchs had survived their abduction. The Emperor adjusted the Crusades' expansion patterns to increase the likelihood of encountering more of his lost sons, directing expeditionary fleets toward regions where unusual phenomena had been reported. The reunion with Leman Russ on Fenris added a new dimension to the Great Crusade. Raised among the tribal warriors of that ice-bound death world, Russ brought a ferocity and martial tradition that transformed the 6th Legion from disciplined soldiers into something more primal. The Emperor immediately recognized the value of this transformation, employing the newly renamed Space Wolves as executioners against particularly stubborn resistance, and possibly as a check against other legions if they should ever falter in their loyalty. The discovery of Ferrus Manus on Medusa similarly enhanced the Crusades' capabilities. The Gorgon's affinity for technology and uncompromising strength made the Iron Hands Legion exceptionally effective in campaigns against heavily fortified worlds. Their close relationship with the Mechanicum facilitated better integration of Mars Tagmata forces into expeditionary fleets, improving the overall technological edge of Imperial forces. While the Emperor led the most significant compliance actions personally during the early Great Crusade, he also devoted considerable time to establishing the administrative structures that would govern newly compliant worlds. Working closely with Malcador the Sigillite, he developed tiered systems of planetary governance, standardized taxation protocols, and infrastructure development programs that could be implemented by Imperial administrators without requiring his direct oversight. The Mechanicum played a crucial role in this administrative expansion. Tech priests accompanied each expeditionary fleet, assessing newly compliant worlds for industrial potential and technological recovery opportunities. Forge worlds, planets dedicated entirely to manufacturing, were established in strategically important systems, creating production hubs that could supply multiple sectors with weapons, vehicles, and void ships. The relationship between the Imperium and the Mechanicum grew increasingly symbiotic as the Crusade progressed, with each organization providing resources and expertise the other lacked. The Emperor's grand design for humanity's future had been violently disrupted when his 20 Primarch sons were scattered across the galaxy. Yet with characteristic determination, he adapted his plans and launched the Great Crusade despite this setback. As Imperial forces pushed outward from Terra, reclaiming lost human worlds and establishing compliance, the Emperor maintained a parallel mission of profound personal importance, the recovery of his genetically engineered offspring. The search for the Primarchs was methodical and resource-intensive. Specialized astropathic choirs aboard the Emperor's flagship, Bucephalus, constantly scanned for distinctive psychic signatures that might indicate a Primarch's presence. Navigator houses were commissioned to investigate anomalous warp phenomena that could be linked to the Primarch's arrival on distant worlds. The Emperor even deployed elite custodian search teams to investigate worlds where unusual leaders had rapidly risen to prominence, recognizing that his sons' transhuman abilities would naturally elevate them above baseline humans regardless of their circumstances. Horus Lupercal was the first Primarch recovered, found on the mining world of Thonia in the Sol system's near vicinity. The proximity of Thonia to Terra has led some Imperial historians to speculate that the ruinous powers deliberately placed the future Warmaster close to his father, though such theories remain speculative. What is certain is that the young Horus had risen from the brutal gang hierarchies of Thonia's mining tunnels to become a powerful warlord by the time the Emperor's forces arrived. The Emperor immediately recognized his son despite the cultural trappings of Thonian society that Horus had adopted. Their first meeting, witnessed by a small contingent of custodians and Luna Wolves officers, was reportedly profound. The Emperor approached the young warlord not as a conqueror claiming a subordinate, but as a father reclaiming a lost child. Horus, for his part, felt an immediate connection to the golden armored figure before him, a genetic recognition that transcended his Thonian upbringing. The Emperor spent considerable time with Horus following their reunion, personally instructing him in the arts of leadership, strategy, and the wider Imperial vision in a way he would not do with his later found sons. For months, Horus accompanied the Emperor everywhere, learning at his side during compliance negotiations, military campaigns, and administrative councils. This intensive mentorship forged a bond between father and son that would shape the character of the Great Crusade for decades to come. When the emperor eventually entrusted Horus with command of the 16th Legion, the Primarch proved more than equal to the responsibility. He quickly absorbed the Legion's existing combat doctrines and organizational structures, then improved upon them with insights gained from his Chthonian background. Under his leadership, the Luna Wolves developed their signature spear-tip assault tactics, concentrating elite forces at a critical point to decapitate enemy command structures and achieve rapid victory with minimal casualties. The discovery of Leman Russ on the death world of Fenris marked the recovery of the Second Primarch. Unlike the relatively straightforward integration of Horus into imperial hierarchy, Russ presented more significant cultural challenges. Raised among the barbaric tribes of Fenris, Russ had become their greatest warrior king, steeped in superstition and ritual that ran counter to the rational secularism of the imperial truth. The emperor's approach to Russ demonstrated his adaptability in handling his disparate sons. Rather than demanding immediate compliance with imperial cultural norms, he engaged with Russ on the Primarch's own terms. Imperial chronicles record that the emperor challenged Russ to 3 contests, one of eating, one of drinking, and one of combat. Only by defeating the Wolf King in these trials, conducted according to Fenrisian tradition, did the emperor earn Russ's respect and allegiance. Rogal Dorn's discovery provided a study in contrast to the more volatile reunions with Primarchs like Russ. Found on the ice world of Inwit, Dorn had become the patriarch of the House of Dorn, a civilization renowned for its stoic pragmatism and architectural achievements. When the Emperor's fleet arrived in the Inwit system, they found not a primitive warrior society, but an efficiently governed stellar empire spanning multiple systems. Dorn's reunion with the Emperor was characterized by immediate recognition and acceptance of duty. Imperial records describe how the Primarch knelt before his father without hesitation, presenting the Emperor with the massive mobile fortress monastery known as the Phalanx as his contribution to the Great Crusade. This gesture exemplified Dorn's character, practical, dutiful, and devoted to service above personal ambition. The Emperor quickly recognized Dorn's value as a stabilizing influence within the growing brotherhood of Primarchs. Where some of his sons were mercurial or driven by complex personal motivations, Dorn's straightforward loyalty and strategic acumen made him an ideal counterbalance. The Emperor entrusted him with increasingly important compliance actions, particularly those requiring careful consolidation of newly acquired territories. Sanguinius, perhaps the most visually distinctive of the Primarchs with his massive white wings, was discovered on the radiation-soaked death world of Baal. The winged Primarch had united the scattered human tribes of Baal Secundus, leading them in a desperate struggle for survival against mutants and environmental hazards. When the Emperor's fleet arrived, they found a society that venerated Sanguinius as a literal angel, a divine being who had descended from the heavens to save them. The meeting between the Emperor and Sanguinius was particularly poignant. The winged Primarch reportedly approached his father with a mixture of joy and trepidation, concerned that his obvious mutation would be viewed as impurity by the master of mankind. Instead, the Emperor embraced Sanguinius, accepting his physical differences while recognizing the nobility of spirit that had allowed him to create a civilization of honor and sacrifice amid Baal's harsh conditions. Sanguinius's integration into the Great Crusade proved remarkably smooth despite his unusual appearance. His natural charisma and tactical brilliance quickly earned the respect of imperial military commanders, while his genuine compassion for human populations made him particularly effective in compliance actions requiring cultural integration rather than military conquest. The Emperor frequently deployed the Blood Angels to worlds where compliance might be achieved through inspiration rather than force, recognizing Sanguinius's unique ability to embody the most noble aspects of the imperial vision. The Emperor's assessment of each Primarch went far beyond their military capabilities. He carefully evaluated how their developmental experiences had shaped their characters, recognizing both strengths and potential weaknesses. The cultural influences of their adoptive homeworlds had created 20 unique individuals, rather than the carefully calibrated leadership cadre he had originally envisioned. This diversity required the emperor to adjust his approach to each son, balancing their individual traits against the needs of the expanding imperium. Ferrous Manus, discovered on the harsh mining world of Medusa, exemplified how a Primarch's adoptive culture could amplify certain aspects of their engineered nature. The emperor had designed the 10th Primarch with an affinity for technology and unyielding determination. Medusa's brutal environment, where survival depended on mastery of machinery and raw physical strength, had intensified these traits to create a Primarch who valued mechanical efficiency and scorned weakness in any form. The emperor recognized both the tremendous value and potential limitations in Ferris's worldview. The Primarch's close affinity with the Mechanicum facilitated crucial technological cooperation, while his uncompromising leadership style made the Iron Hands Legion exceptionally effective in certain campaign types. Yet the emperor also noted Ferris's tendency toward inflexibility and his sometimes problematic equation of human emotion with weakness, traits that required careful management within the broader imperial command structure. Roboute Guilliman's discovery on Macragge presented the emperor with a Primarch who had already realized much of his potential as a leader and statesman. Unlike many of his brothers who had become warriors or warlords, Guilliman had built a sophisticated civilization, serving as consul of Macragge and architect of the flourishing Ultramar Empire. His adoptive culture had emphasized governance, logistics, and civic responsibility alongside martial prowess. The emperor immediately recognized the unique value Guilliman brought to the Great Crusade. Here was a son who understood not just how to conquer worlds, but how to govern them afterward, a skill increasingly important as the Imperium expanded. The emperor spent significant time discussing administrative systems with Guilliman, incorporating many of the Primarch's innovations into the broader imperial governance structure, while helping him understand the larger strategic necessities that sometimes required prioritizing military objectives over ideal civic development. As more Primarchs were discovered and integrated into the Great Crusade, the emperor carefully managed their interactions with one another. He recognized that these transhuman beings, created with distinct temperaments and raised in wildly different cultures, would naturally develop complex relationships, some collaborative, others competitive, or even antagonistic. Rather than suppressing these dynamics, the emperor channeled them productively, pairing complementary Primarchs for joint campaigns while keeping potentially volatile combinations separated. The partnership between Horus and Sanguinius exemplified successful Primarch collaboration. The emperor deliberately assigned their legions to joint campaigns, recognizing how Horus's pragmatic efficiency balanced Sanguinius's idealism, while Sanguinius's compassion tempered Horus's occasionally excessive focus on victory at any cost. Their mutual respect grew into a brotherhood that strengthened both legions' effectiveness. Conversely, the emperor kept Angron's World Eaters separated from legions like the Ultramarines, recognizing that the 12th Primarch's uncontrolled aggression and bitter resentment toward his own rescue circumstances would create dangerous friction with Guilliman's more measured approach. Such management of inter-legion dynamics became increasingly complex as more Primarchs took command of their forces, requiring constant adjustment to expedition fleet compositions and campaign assignments. As the Great Crusade progressed and the number of recovered Primarchs grew, the emperor began to step back from direct leadership of military campaigns. This calculated withdrawal served multiple purposes. It allowed the Primarchs to develop their leadership skills independently, tested their ability to cooperate without his direct oversight, and freed the emperor to focus on crucial projects, including the Human Webway Initiative. The emperor's decision to elevate Horus to the position of War Master in the 31st millennium marked a pivotal moment in Primarch dynamics. Made during the triumph at Ullanr following a significant victory against Orc forces, this appointment formalized what had already been emerging informally, a hierarchical structure among the theoretically equal Primarchs. Horus would now speak with the emperor's authority in military matters, commanding his brothers as the Great Crusade continued its expansion. The psychological impact of this decision varied dramatically among the Primarchs. Some, like Rogel Dorn and Sanguinius, accepted it without reservation, recognizing both Horus's capabilities and the practical necessity of having a single military commander, as the Imperium grew too vast for even the Emperor to oversee directly. Others harbored more complex reactions, accepting the decision publicly while privately questioning its wisdom or fairness. Robute Guilliman, while acknowledging Horus's tactical brilliance, had concerns about the War Master's occasional impulsiveness and theatrical flair. He nevertheless committed the Ultramarines fully to the new command structure, recognizing the importance of unity within the Imperial forces. Guilliman's pragmatism allowed him to set aside personal reservations in service to the Emperor's broader vision. Perturabo of the Iron Warriors received the news with outward stoicism that masked deep resentment. The Lord of Iron had long felt his legion's contributions were undervalued, assigned to grueling siege warfare and garrison duties, while others received glory. Horus's elevation seemed to confirm his suspicion that the Emperor played favorites among his sons, further deepening Perturabo's sense of grievance. For Mortarion, the Death Lord of the Death Guard, the appointment reinforced his existing skepticism toward the Emperor's plans. Raised on toxic Barbarus under the tyranny of Xeno's overlords, Mortarion had developed a deep suspicion of concentrated authority. While he respected Horus's abilities, the creation of the War Master position struck him as an unnecessary concentration of power that mirrored the hierarchical structures he had fought against on his homeworld. As the Great Crusade stretched across the stars, bringing countless human worlds back into the fold, the Emperor recognized that military conquest alone would not secure humanity's future. Beneath the thunder of bolter fire and the march of power-armored legionnaires lay a more subtle but equally crucial campaign, the propagation of the imperial truth. This secular, rationalist doctrine represented not merely an ideological preference, but a calculated weapon against humanity's greatest existential threat, the malevolent entities that lurked within the immaterium. The imperial truth took shape during the later years of the Unification Wars, when the Emperor first began to codify his vision for human civilization. At its core lay an absolute rejection of religion, superstition, and mysticism in favor of reason, science, and verifiable evidence. The doctrine denied the existence of gods, demons, and other supernatural entities, classifying such beliefs as dangerous delusions that had contributed to humanity's fragmentation during the Age of Strife. This secular philosophy served a dual purpose that few within the nascent Imperium fully understood. Beyond its stated goal of fostering scientific progress and rational governance, the imperial truth functioned as a psychic shield against the ruinous powers. The Emperor, with his unparalleled understanding of the warp, recognized that faith and worship empowered the entities that dwelled there. By starving these beings of human belief, the imperial truth would theoretically weaken their influence over real space and protect humanity during its vulnerable period of reunification. To spread this doctrine across thousands of worlds with diverse cultural traditions, the Emperor established the iterators, elite orators, philosophers, and cultural engineers tasked with reshaping the beliefs of newly compliant populations. These individuals underwent extensive training in rhetoric, psychology, and mimetic theory, enabling them to dismantle entrenched religious systems and replace them with secular rationalism. The most skilled iterators could convert entire populations through carefully structured public debates and presentations, their arguments so compelling that listeners found their lifelong beliefs dissolving under the weight of reason. Kyril Sinderman exemplified the iterator core at its most effective. A master rhetorician with an encyclopedic knowledge of human philosophy, Sinderman accompanied Horus's 63rd Expeditionary Fleet, preparing worlds for compliance through cultural persuasion before military force became necessary. His debates became legendary, with even the most stubborn religious leaders finding themselves unable to counter his methodical dismantling of their faith-based claims. When physical resistance proved inevitable, Sinderman's preliminary work often reduced its intensity by converting key segments of the population to the imperial truth beforehand. The Emperor directed that every expeditionary fleet include iterators alongside its military forces, recognizing that ideological compliance proved as important as physical submission. On worlds where resistance stemmed primarily from religious differences, iterators sometimes achieved compliance without a single bolter being fired. The population of Artemis Prime, for instance, abandoned their worship of celestial entities after a 3-month iterator mission systematically demonstrated how their gods were merely misunderstood astronomical phenomena. For populations too entrenched in their beliefs for peaceful conversion, the Emperor authorized more forceful approaches. The chaplain corps of the Word-Bearers Legion initially specialized in this work before their Primarch Lorgar redirected their efforts toward more problematic ends. These warrior priests would oversee the systematic dismantling of religious institutions, the destruction of temples and shrines, and the confiscation of religious texts for imperial archives. While the Emperor preferred bloodless ideological conversion, he proved willing to enforce the imperial truth through more direct means when necessary. The suppression of religion extended beyond human faiths to include prohibition of Xenos worship, which the Emperor considered particularly dangerous. Several human worlds encountered during the Great Crusade had developed religions centered around alien entities, either through cultural exchange with non-hostile Xenos or through misinterpreting alien artifacts as divine objects. The Emperor ordered the complete eradication of such belief systems, considering them not merely irrational, but potentially compromising to human genetic and cultural integrity. To complement the work of the iterators, the Emperor established vast educational institutions on compliant worlds. These Schola Imperialis facilities taught the scientific method, technological principles, and rational philosophy, while systematically excluding mystical or supernatural explanations for natural phenomena. The curricula emphasized humanity's potential for self-determination through reason and technology, presenting the Emperor not as a god, but as the exemplar of human achievement, the pinnacle of what humanity could become through science and willpower. The imperial truth also incorporated elements of species-level patriotism, fostering the belief that humanity held a special destiny among the stars. This aspect of the doctrine proved particularly effective on frontier worlds that had suffered from alien predation during the Age of Strife. Iterators presented the Great Crusade as humanity's rightful reclamation of the galaxy, positioning mankind as the inheritor of the stars by virtue of its resilience and adaptability rather than through divine mandate. While the Emperor publicly maintained that the imperial truth served primarily to accelerate human progress through rationalism, his private communications with Malcador and select primarchs revealed deeper concerns. The Emperor understood that humanity stood at a critical evolutionary juncture, with increasing numbers of humans developing psychic abilities. This psychic awakening, if left unmanaged, would expose the species to predation from warp entities on an unprecedented scale. The Emperor's long-term vision involved shepherding humanity through this evolutionary transition toward becoming a fully psychic species while protecting it from the dangers such development entailed. The imperial truth formed one component of this protection, reducing humanity's vulnerability by eliminating belief systems that could provide warp entities access to human consciousness. Simultaneously, the Emperor pursued technological solutions through his Webway project, which would eventually allow humanity to bypass warp travel entirely, further reducing exposure to immaterial threats. The Webway project represented perhaps the most ambitious element of the Emperor's vision for humanity's future. Hidden beneath the Imperial Palace on Terra, this massive undertaking aimed to connect human-controlled space through a network of artificial tunnels through the Immaterium, similar to those used by the Eldar, but engineered specifically for human requirements. Success would free mankind from dependence on warp travel and its inherent dangers while providing instantaneous transportation between distant worlds. The Golden Throne, often misunderstood by later Imperial scholars as merely a life support device, was originally designed as the control mechanism for the human webway. This massive psychic amplifier would allow the Emperor to breach the barriers between real space and the webway dimension, creating stable access points that human engineers could then expand and reinforce. The project consumed enormous resources and required the emperor's direct psychic involvement, contributing significantly to his decision to withdraw from the Great Crusade and return to Terra. Only a handful of individuals understood the full scope of the Webway project and its central importance to the emperor's plans. Magnus the Red received partial information due to his psychic expertise, though even he did not grasp its complete significance. Malkador the Sigillite oversaw administrative aspects, coordinating the thousands of workers, engineers, and psychers involved without fully comprehending the technical details. The Custodian Guard maintained security around the project site, preventing unauthorized access while remaining largely ignorant of what they protected. The Emperor's vision extended beyond even these monumental undertakings to encompass humanity's distant future as a psychically mature species. He foresaw a time when humans would evolve beyond their current limitations, developing psychic abilities that would allow them to reshape reality through thought alone. This evolution would eventually place humanity on par with, or even superior to, the entities of the warp, transforming the species into something transcendent while maintaining its essential human character. This grand vision, however, contained inherent contradictions that grew increasingly problematic as the Great Crusade progressed. Chief among these was the tension between the Emperor's secular materialist doctrine and his own increasingly divine perception by ordinary humans. Despite the imperial truth's explicit rejection of divinity, soldiers and civilians throughout the expanding Imperium began to worship the Emperor as a god. His transhuman abilities, golden appearance, and the literal light that seemed to emanate from his person naturally evoked religious awe in those who encountered him. The Emperor consistently rejected such worship, sometimes harshly. When the population of Nelbach III prostrated themselves before him as a divine being, he reportedly ordered the iterators to spend 3 additional months on the planet, personally overseeing a series of public demonstrations to prove his physical, non-divine nature. Yet despite these efforts, the cult of emperor worship continued to spread, particularly on worlds where imperial forces had liberated the population from genuine threats or improved living conditions dramatically. This contradiction reached its most problematic expression in the case of the 17th Legion and their primarch, Lorgar Aurelian. Raised in a deeply religious society on Colchis, Lorgar brought an inherently spiritual perspective to his understanding of the Emperor and the Great Crusade. Rather than embracing the secular imperial truth, he interpreted the Emperor as the god humanity had always sought, and the Crusade as a holy mission to spread this divine truth throughout the stars. For decades, Lorgar's word-bearers conquered worlds in the Emperor's name, then spent years establishing elaborate emperor worship before moving to new conquests. They built vast cathedrals, created religious texts praising the emperor's divinity, and established priesthoods to maintain the faith. This approach, while effective at ensuring compliance, directly contradicted the emperor's stated vision and significantly slowed the 17th Legion's contribution to the Great Crusade's territorial expansion. The Emperor's response to Lorgar's religious fervor demonstrated both the importance he placed on the imperial truth and the limitations of his approach to managing his transhuman sons. After allowing this behavior to continue for nearly a century, the Emperor suddenly and publicly rebuked Lorgar on the world of Monarchia, using the Ultramarines to destroy the city the word-bearers had built in his honor and forcing Lorgar's legion to kneel in the ashes before him. This humiliation, while intended to correct Lorgar's misunderstanding, instead planted seeds of resentment that would later bear catastrophic fruit. The Emperor's insistence on his non-divine nature faced another challenge in his physical appearance and presence. To most humans who encountered him directly, the Emperor appeared as a towering figure of impossible perfection, his features seeming to shift subtly to represent each observer's cultural ideal of majesty and authority. This phenomenon, likely a psychic projection either unconscious or deliberately employed to facilitate leadership, undermined the very secular rationalism he espoused by presenting an image that transcended normal human parameters. Even among the Primarchs, who possessed transhuman perceptions resistant to such manipulation, the Emperor appeared differently to each. Corvus Corax perceived him primarily as a scientific genius and liberator, while Liman Rus saw a mighty warrior king worthy of his loyalty. Sanguinius experienced the emperor as a perfect reflection of his own angelic nature, while Perturabo perceived a master artisan whose creations reflected mathematical precision. These varying perceptions suggested either an unconscious psychic projection that adapted to the observer or a deliberate technique employed by the emperor to forge stronger bonds with his genetically engineered sons. The contradiction between the emperor's secular doctrine and his increasingly divine perception created fault lines within the expanding imperium that would eventually contribute to its fracturing. As he withdrew from direct participation in the Great Crusade to focus on the Webway project, the emperor's physical absence allowed religious interpretation of his nature to spread more widely, particularly on distant worlds where iterators had made only brief visits before moving on with the expeditionary fleets. Despite these growing contradictions, the emperor remained committed to his vision of a rational, secular human empire expanding throughout the galaxy. The imperial truth represented not merely an ideological preference, but a practical necessity for humanity's survival against the predatory entities of the warp. By denying these entities the psychological access points that religion and superstition provided, the emperor sought to protect mankind during its vulnerable transitional period before the completion of the Webway project and humanity's eventual psychic maturation. The emperor's vision, ambitious beyond human comprehension, aimed at nothing less than the fundamental transformation of humanity's relationship with the universe. Through the combined application of advanced technology, genetic engineering, and carefully managed cultural evolution, he sought to elevate the human species to its ultimate potential while protecting it from the very real dangers such evolution entailed. The imperial truth, despite its contradictions, formed a crucial component of this protection, a psychic shield against predatory warp entities disguised as a philosophical doctrine. As the Great Crusade expanded across the galaxy, bringing countless worlds into imperial compliance, a growing concern began to cast a shadow over the emperor's grand vision. The increasing manifestation of psychic abilities among the Legion's Astartes raised profound questions about humanity's evolution and the inherent dangers such powers presented. By the 31st millennium, this issue had grown too significant to ignore, prompting the emperor to convene what would become one of the most consequential gatherings in imperial history. The Council of Nicaea took place on a remote, atmospherically sealed amphitheater constructed within a hollowed-out mountain on the isolated world of Nicaea. The location was chosen deliberately for its symbolic neutrality, a barren world far from the centers of imperial power and the domains of any particular primarch. The amphitheater itself was a marvel of imperial engineering, combining practical functionality with subtle grandeur. Tiered seating surrounded a central speaking platform, while advanced acoustics ensured that even whispered words could be heard throughout the chamber. Representatives from all 18 discovered legions attended, including most of the primarchs themselves. The emperor presided from an elevated throne of polished stone, his golden armor catching the light from strategically placed illuminators. Flanking him stood the silent sentinels of the Legio Custodes, their ormite armor gleaming, while members of the Silent Sisterhood maintained a perimeter around the gathering, their null auras creating pockets of psychic emptiness throughout the chamber. The issue at hand had been building for decades. Since the earliest days of the Great Crusade, certain legions had developed specialized units of battle psychers known as librarians. These warriors used their innate psychic talents to devastating effect on the battlefield, reading enemy movements before they occurred, penetrating fortress walls with telekinetic force, or incinerating Xeno's threats with psychically manifested flame. The 15th Legion, led by Magnus the Red, had embraced this development most enthusiastically, establishing formal training protocols and integrating psychic warfare into their core combat doctrine. Other legions had adopted the Librarius with varying degrees of commitment. The Ultramarines maintained a small but highly disciplined core of battle psychers, who operated under strict protocols developed by Robute Guilliman himself. The White Scars valued their Storm Seers not just for combat applications, but for their connection to Chagorian spiritual traditions. The Blood Angels found that their librarians could sometimes mitigate the effects of the red thirst that plagued their legion. Yet this development had not proceeded without opposition. Several Primarchs maintained deep reservations about the use of psychic powers, viewing them as unreliable at best and dangerously corrupting at worst. Leman Russ of the Space Wolves considered Psykers inherently untrustworthy, preferring the more primal but limited abilities of his rune priests, whom he insisted drew power from Fenris itself rather than the warp. Corvus Corax of the Raven Guard expressed concerns about the unpredictable nature of psychic phenomena and their potential to compromise stealth operations. Most vehement in his opposition was Mortarion of the Death Guard. The Lord of Barbarous had grown up fighting against psychic overlords who had used their powers to enslave and torment human populations. His personal experience had instilled in him an unshakable conviction that psychic abilities were inherently corrupting and would eventually lead to the degradation of those who wielded them. The Death Guard maintained no librarius, and Mortarion actively discouraged any expression of psychic talent within his legion. As the council began, Magnus the Red presented the first major argument in favor of psychic development. The Crimson King cut an imposing figure as he took the central platform, his massive form clad in ornate armor, adorned with Egyptian-inspired iconography, his single eye burning with intensity. Magnus spoke with the confidence of one who had mastered his subject matter completely, his voice resonating through the chamber without need for amplification. Magnus framed psychic ability as the next stage in human evolution, a natural progression that should be embraced rather than feared. He detailed how carefully trained psychers could safely navigate the perils of the warp, drawing power from it while maintaining their integrity. The Thousand Suns Librarius, he explained, employed multiple layers of safeguards, including mental disciplines, protective wards, and peer monitoring systems that had proven effective at preventing corruption. Most significantly, Magnus argued that suppressing psychic development would be not just counterproductive, but potentially catastrophic for humanity's future. He presented evidence from dozens of worlds where repressed psychic talents had eventually manifested in uncontrolled outbursts, often with devastating consequences. The path forward, he insisted, lay not in denial but in disciplined cultivation of these abilities under proper imperial guidance. When Magnus concluded, Mortarion stepped forward to present the opposing view. Where the Crimson King had been eloquent and passionate, the Death Lord spoke with cold precision. His pallid features remained largely expressionless as he methodically laid out his case against the Librarius program, his voice carrying the slight rasp that had become his trademark. Mortarion recounted his experiences on Barbarous, describing in clinical detail how the Psyker overlords had used their powers to torment and control the human population. He then presented a meticulously compiled record of incidents across multiple expeditionary fleets where psychic abilities had led to catastrophe, librarians losing control during battle, unwittingly opening their minds to warp entities, or succumbing to power-induced madness. Each case was presented dispassionately, but the cumulative effect painted a damning picture. The Death Lord's most compelling argument concerned the inherent unpredictability of the warp itself. No matter how disciplined the Psyker, he argued, the Immaterium remained fundamentally inimical to human understanding and control. To draw power from such a source was to invite inevitable corruption, regardless of intention or precaution. The only safe approach, Mortarion concluded, was complete prohibition of psychic practices within the Legion's Astartes. Other Primarchs contributed perspectives that fell between these two extremes. Sanguinius acknowledged the risks involved in psychic development, but suggested that with proper safeguards, the benefits outweighed the dangers. Jagatai Khan spoke of how his people had long maintained traditions that allowed controlled use of psychic abilities without falling into corruption. Lorgar Aurelian, still recovering from his humiliation at Monarchia, remained noticeably reticent throughout the proceedings, though observers noted his thoughtful attention to all arguments presented. Robute Gilliman proposed a compromise position, strict regulation rather than outright prohibition. Under his suggested framework, librarians would operate according to standardized imperial protocols, undergo regular testing for corruption, and be subject to oversight by specialized officers trained to recognize signs of warp influence. This middle path gained support from several Primarchs who recognized both the potential value and inherent risks of psychic warfare. Throughout these presentations, the Emperor remained silent, his expression unreadable as he listened to his son's debate. Only after all viewpoints had been expressed did he finally rise to deliver his judgment. The chamber fell into absolute silence as the Master of Mankind stepped forward, his presence seeming to fill the vast amphitheater, despite his physical form remaining unchanged. The Emperor's ruling came as a shock to many present, particularly those who had advocated for the continued development of the Librarius program. He decreed that all legions must disband their Librarius divisions immediately. Psychic abilities were not to be employed by the legions Astartes under any circumstances. Those with psychic talents would be required to refrain from using them and would be monitored for compliance. This edict became known as the Edict of Nicaea, a binding imperial decree that fundamentally altered the operational capabilities of several legions. The Emperor explained his decision not as a rejection of humanity's psychic potential, but as a necessary precaution during a critical period of imperial expansion. Unregulated psychic activity, he stated, presented too great a risk to the Great Crusade and to the individuals who might fall prey to warp predation. For Magnus the Red, this ruling represented not just a tactical setback, but a personal repudiation. The Crimson King had built his entire legion around psychic mastery, integrating these abilities into every aspect of their combat doctrine and cultural identity. More than any other Primarch, Magnus had dedicated himself to understanding and harnessing the warp through disciplined study and practice. The Emperor's decision struck at the core of everything he had worked to build. The apparent contradiction in the Emperor's position was not lost on those present. Here was the most powerful human psyker in existence, whose own abilities far surpassed anything demonstrated by the librarians of any legion, prohibiting others from developing similar talents. The Emperor, who had created the Primarchs through a combination of genetic science and warp-based techniques, was now declaring such practices too dangerous for his own sons to explore. This contradiction became even more stark when considered alongside what some of the Primarchs knew about the Emperor's ongoing projects on Terra. The Webway Initiative, though its details remained closely guarded, clearly involved massive psychic operations directed by the Emperor himself. Magnus, who had glimpsed portions of this work through his own psychic perceptions, found it difficult to reconcile the Emperor's personal use of warp energies with his prohibition against others doing the same. For the Thousand Sons, compliance with the edict presented nearly insurmountable challenges. Their entire combat methodology relied on psychic abilities, from battlefield divination to telekinetic manipulation of enemy forces. Magnus faced the prospect of fundamentally reimagining his legion's approach to warfare or risking censure for non-compliance. The strain this placed on his relationship with the Emperor would have far-reaching consequences that few at Nicaea could have anticipated. Other legions found the transition less traumatic, but still significant. The Ultramarines methodically disbanded their Librarius, reassigning battle psychers to conventional combat roles and establishing monitoring protocols to ensure compliance with the edict. The White Scars officially complied, while maintaining that their Storm Seers drew power from different sources than conventional psychers, a position similar to that taken by the Space Wolves regarding their Rune Priests. The Emperor's decision at Nicaea revealed much about his approach to managing the risks inherent in humanity's evolution. Rather than allowing uncontrolled development that might proceed too quickly for proper safeguards, he chose to temporarily restrict psychic advancement while he completed the Webway project, an initiative that would eventually provide humanity with safer alternatives to warp travel and communication. The edict represented not a permanent rejection of psychic development, but a strategic pause to allow technological solutions to catch up with biological potential. This approach aligned with the Emperor's broader pattern of carefully managing humanity's advancement. Throughout the Great Crusade, he had systematically suppressed or controlled technologies and practices that presented existential risks, from artificial intelligence to certain forms of genetic manipulation. The restriction on psychic abilities followed this same cautious template, sacrificing short-term advantages for long-term security. What remained unspoken during the council, but understood by the Emperor's inner circle, was the growing evidence of hostile entities within the warp that specifically targeted psykers. These beings, which would later be more widely recognized as the Chaos Gods and their servants, used unprotected or undisciplined minds as gateways into real space. The Emperor's personal psychic power and knowledge provided him with defenses against such intrusions, but lesser psykers remained vulnerable without similar protections. As the Council of Nicaea concluded and the Primarchs departed with their entourages, few recognized the full significance of what had transpired. The edict would prove to be not just a military directive, but a pivotal moment in the relationship between the Emperor and his sons, particularly Magnus, whose subsequent actions would be profoundly shaped by his perception of the ruling as a rejection of his life's work and his legion's fundamental nature. The apparent contradiction between the Emperor's own nature as the most powerful human psyker and his prohibition against others developing similar abilities would continue to resonate throughout the Imperium. This tension between what the Emperor was and what he decreed would become one of many factors contributing to the fracturing of his vision for humanity's future, a fracturing that would eventually manifest in the most devastating conflict humanity had ever known. The decision to return to Terra was not made hastily. As the Emperor stood on the observation deck of the Bucephalus following the triumph at Ullanr, his gaze fixed not on the celebrating legions below, but on the distant stars, he weighed the complex variables that would shape humanity's future. The Great Crusade had achieved remarkable success, with nearly 20,000 worlds brought into imperial compliance. His Primarch sons, with only a few exceptions, had been recovered and now led their respective legions across the galaxy. The time had come to focus on the next phase of his grand design. The Emperor summoned Horus to a private chamber aboard the flagship, away from the celebrations and ceremonies that marked the greatest triumph of the Great Crusade. There, surrounded by star charts and strategic projections, he informed his favored son of his decision to return to Terra. The newly appointed War Master received this news with a complex mixture of pride and apprehension. While the elevation to Supreme Commander of the Imperium's military forces represented unprecedented trust, Horus understood that he was being asked to shoulder a burden previously borne by the Master of Mankind himself. What the Emperor did not share with Horus, what he shared with almost no one, was the true purpose behind his return. The Human Webway project had reached a critical juncture that required his direct and continuous oversight. Deep beneath the Imperial Palace, Mechanicum Adepts and the Emperor's personal gene rights had constructed massive technological arrays designed to bridge the gap between real space and the labyrinthine dimension used by the Eldar for instantaneous travel. This project represented humanity's potential liberation from reliance on warp travel, with all its inherent dangers and limitations. The Emperor's departure from the front lines of the Great Crusade sent ripples of uncertainty through the Imperium's command structure. While Horus had been formally invested with the authority to direct the ongoing expansion, many Primarchs harbored private concerns about this new arrangement. Rogel Dorn and Sanguinius publicly pledged their complete support to the War Master, while maintaining direct communication channels with their father. Robute Guilliman accepted the decision with characteristic practicality, immediately working to establish efficient coordination protocols between his Ultramarines and Horus's command staff. Others received the news less favorably. Perturabo of the Iron Warriors interpreted the Emperor's withdrawal as further evidence of his legion being undervalued, assigned to thankless siege warfare while others received recognition. Angron, never fully reconciled to Imperial service after his forced separation from his fellow gladiators on Nuceria, viewed the Emperor's departure as abandonment. These simmering resentments, though not immediately apparent, would grow more significant in the coming years. The Imperial Palace on Terra underwent dramatic transformation as the Emperor returned to direct its expansion personally. What had begun as a formidable fortress complex spanning the Himalayan mountains now extended to cover much of the Asian continent. New defensive systems were integrated into its structure, including massive void shields capable of withstanding orbital bombardment and automated artillery emplacements that could target threats from ground or air with equal precision. The outer walls, reinforced with adamantium and enhanced ceramite, stood hundreds of meters high, creating an impregnable barrier around the inner sanctums. Beneath these visible fortifications, the Emperor established what would become known as the Imperial Dungeon, a vast complex of laboratories, containment chambers, and research facilities dedicated to the Webway project. The most sensitive areas were accessible only to the Emperor himself and a select few custodians who served as his personal guard. Even Malkador the Sigillite, granted nearly unlimited authority in other imperial matters, received only partial information about the activities conducted in these deepest vaults. The Golden Throne, a massive psychic amplifier that served as the linchpin of the Webway project, occupied the central chamber of this underground complex. Originally designed as a control mechanism rather than a life support device, this ancient technology combined Dark Age innovations with the Emperor's unique understanding of the warp. Through this device, the Emperor could project his consciousness into the Webway, stabilizing the human-made portions and gradually expanding the network that would eventually connect all Imperial worlds. The work proved more challenging than even the Emperor had anticipated. The Webway, created by the ancient Eldar at the height of their civilization, operated according to principles that defied conventional human understanding. Its pathways existed in a liminal space between real space and the warp, protected by sophisticated psychic engineering that had developed over millions of years. Creating human access points required the Emperor to maintain constant psychic pressure against the natural forces that sought to collapse these artificial tunnels. This continuous psychic exertion meant that the Emperor spent increasing amounts of time seated upon the Golden Throne, his physical body relatively immobile while his mind worked across dimensions. During these periods, he relied on Malkador and Constantin Valdor to manage the daily operations of the Imperium. Malkador oversaw the burgeoning administrative apparatus that would eventually become the Adeptus Terra, while Valdor directed the Legio Custodes in establishing unprecedented security measures throughout the palace complex. The Mechanicum played a crucial role in the Webway project, though few tech priests understood its full significance. Specialized forge temples were established within the palace grounds, producing components to the Emperor's exact specifications without comprehending their ultimate purpose. The highest-ranking Mechanicum representatives, including delegates from the Fabricator General's inner circle, were granted limited access to the outer chambers of the Imperial Dungeon, where they assisted with the integration of mechanical and psychic technologies. This collaboration strengthened the bonds between Terra and Mars, with the Emperor taking special care to maintain the Mechanicum's allegiance during this critical period. He authorized the transfer of certain technological templates from his personal archives to the Martian priesthood, carefully selected to advance their capabilities without revealing dangerous knowledge. These gestures of trust helped secure continued Mechanicum support despite the increasingly secretive nature of the Emperor's work. The Sisters of Silence, with their unique null abilities, provided essential security for the Webway project. Their presence created zones of psychic nullification that protected sensitive areas from warp intrusion or scrying. The Emperor positioned these silent warriors at key junctures throughout the Imperial Dungeon, creating overlapping fields of psychic blankness that would immediately reveal any unauthorized psychic activity. Their numbers were increased substantially following the Emperor's return to Terra, with recruitment efforts expanding to identify null maidens from across the Imperium. As work on the Webway progressed, the Emperor maintained communication with his Primarch sons through carefully controlled channels. Astropathic choirs, specially trained and equipped with enhanced equipment, transmitted his directives to the far-flung expeditionary fleets. These communications became increasingly formalized and infrequent, focusing on strategic objectives rather than the personal guidance many Primarchs had come to expect. This growing distance, though necessitated by the Emperor's concentration on the Webway project, created a void that would eventually be filled by more malign influences. Rogel Dorn, Primarch of the Imperial Fists, received a unique assignment following the Emperor's return to Terra. His legion, already renowned for their expertise in fortification and siege warfare, was tasked with transforming the imperial palace into an impregnable fortress. Dorn approached this assignment with characteristic thoroughness, conducting comprehensive structural analyses and implementing defensive systems that incorporated both ancient technologies and innovations developed during the Great Crusade. The Praetorian established his command center within the palace walls, personally overseeing the most critical defensive installations. Under his direction, void shield generators of unprecedented power were installed beneath reinforced bunkers, capable of projecting protective fields over the entire palace complex. Automated defense turrets, their machine spirits calibrated by the finest mechanicum artisans, were positioned along strategic approaches. Deep bunkers were excavated beneath the palace foundations, creating fallback positions that could sustain imperial operations even under the most determined assault. While Dorn focused on physical defenses, the Emperor implemented more subtle protective measures. Psychic wards were incorporated into the palace's structure, their geometric patterns designed to disrupt warp energies and prevent unauthorized materialization. These wards, invisible to normal perception but blindingly apparent to psychic senses, created layered barriers against immaterial threats. The Emperor personally inscribed the most powerful of these wards, using techniques developed through millennia of studying warp phenomena. The Emperor's foresight regarding potential threats extended beyond conventional military considerations. He established specialized containment facilities within the Imperial dungeon, designed to imprison entities that could not be destroyed by conventional means. These chambers incorporated technologies recovered from ancient Xeno civilizations, modified to serve human purposes. Though their exact nature remained known only to the Emperor and his closest advisors, these facilities represented preparation for threats that most imperial authorities could not even conceptualize. The Astronomicon, humanity's psychic beacon that made warp navigation possible, received significant enhancements during this period. Originally powered directly by the Emperor's psychic might, the facility was redesigned to incorporate a choir of psychers who could amplify and focus the Emperor's power, reducing the constant drain on his personal energies. This modification became increasingly important as more of the Emperor's psychic attention was directed toward the Webway project, requiring efficient distribution of his immense but finite psychic resources. Despite the Emperor's physical presence on Terra, his attention was so completely focused on the Webway project that governance of the Imperium increasingly fell to Malcador and the newly established Council of Terra. This administrative body, composed of distinguished imperial officials with specialized areas of expertise, managed the complex logistics of an empire spanning thousands of worlds. Resource allocation, tithe assessment, and judicial oversight all fell under their purview, creating the bureaucratic foundation that would eventually evolve into the High Lords of Terra. The establishment of this civilian authority created tension with the military hierarchy, particularly after millennia of direct rule by the Emperor during the Great Crusade. Some Primarchs, notably Horus, viewed the Council of Terra as an unnecessary layer of bureaucracy that impeded effective military operations. Others, like Guilliman, recognized the necessity of civilian administration, but expressed concerns about the Council's composition, which included no representative from the Legion's Astartes. These administrative changes coincided with the Emperor's decreasing direct communication with his Primarch sons. Where once he had provided personal guidance and regular consultation, now his directives came through formal channels, often filtered through Malcador or the Council. This shift was particularly difficult for Primarchs like Lorgar and Magnus, who had sought their father's approval and wisdom in matters beyond military strategy. The Emperor's retreat to Terra and his focus on the Webway project created a leadership vacuum that Horus struggled to fill completely. Though unquestionably brilliant as a military commander, the newly appointed War Master lacked the transcendent authority of the Emperor himself. Other Primarchs, while respecting Horus's tactical acumen, did not universally accept his right to direct their activities with the same authority as their creator. This situation was further complicated by the Emperor's failure to fully explain his reasons for returning to Terra. Most Primarchs received only the official explanation that the Emperor needed to consolidate the Imperium's administrative foundations, without any mention of the Webway project or the existential threats it was designed to counter. This information gap left even loyal Primarchs questioning their father's priorities and feeling increasingly disconnected from his grand vision. For Magnus the Red, already smarting from the restrictions imposed at Nicaea, the Emperor's withdrawal represented a particularly painful separation. Of all the Primarchs, Magnus had the greatest psychic potential and the deepest understanding of the warp. He sensed, though imperfectly, the massive psychic operations being conducted on Terra and recognized their importance. Yet he remained excluded from this work, his legion's psychic traditions officially censured, while the Emperor himself conducted warp manipulations on an unprecedented scale. The 1,000 Sons, stationed on their homeworld of Prospero, complied with the letter of the Nicaea Edict while continuing their psychic studies in more theoretical forms. Magnus directed his legion to document their accumulated knowledge in secure archives, preserving their understanding of the warp while technically refraining from active psychic operations. This compromise allowed the Crimson King to maintain his legion's identity while awaiting what he hoped would be an eventual reconsideration of the Emperor's position. As the Great Crusade continued under Horus's direction, the Emperor's attention remained fixed on the Webway. Each day brought incremental progress as new sections of the human-made tunnels were stabilized and expanded. The work was painstaking and dangerous. Any lapse in concentration could allow the Immaterium to break through the artificial barriers, potentially creating a catastrophic breach on Terra itself. The Emperor's psychic power, unmatched among humanity, made him the only being capable of maintaining these complex manipulations for extended periods. The Custodian Guard, ever vigilant in their protection of the Master of Mankind, adapted to this new reality with characteristic efficiency. While the Emperor worked within the Webway, his physical form remained vulnerable despite its transhuman resilience. Constantin Valdor established rotating security details that maintained constant watch over the Golden Throne chamber, with the most trusted custodians personally selected for this duty. Additional layers of security extended outward from this central point, creating a defense-in-depth approach that would require any potential threat to overcome multiple specialized obstacles. The Emperor's retreat to Terra, necessary for humanity's long-term survival through the Webway project, created immediate challenges for the ongoing Great Crusade. The carefully balanced relationship between the Primarchs, maintained in part through their shared connection to their creator, began to show signs of strain without his direct oversight. Old rivalries intensified, and new grievances emerged as the brothers competed for resources and recognition under Horus's command. As the Emperor devoted his immense psychic energies to the Imperial Webway project beneath the palace, subtle tremors of corruption began to manifest throughout the expanding Imperium. The Master of Mankind, with his unparalleled warp sensitivity, detected these disturbances long before they coalesced into open rebellion. Fragments of intelligence from distant expeditionary fleets, psychic impressions gleaned during brief respites from the Golden Throne, and reports from his most trusted agents painted an increasingly troubling picture of chaos influence infiltrating the Legion's Astartes. The Emperor's first concrete suspicions emerged following unusual patterns of behavior in several Legion deployments. The word-bearers, after their humiliation at Monarchia, had abruptly increased their compliance efficiency, a development that should have been positive but struck the Emperor as uncharacteristic given Lorgar's temperament. Intelligence gathered by Malcador's agents indicated the 17th Legion was making contact with isolated human cultures with unusual religious practices before destroying all records of these encounters. The Emperor dispatched specialized observation teams to monitor the word-bearers, but maintained his focus on the Webway project, judging the potential threat as concerning but not yet critical. More alarming were the reports concerning the Death Guard's activities in the Barbarous sector. Several worlds brought to compliance by Mortarian's Legion had experienced subsequent population culls attributed to endemic disease conditions. Yet Mechanicum biological survey teams had found no evidence of such pathogens before the Death Guard's arrival. The Emperor directed the Silent Sisterhood to investigate these incidents, their null presence providing protection against potential warp influence. Their findings, while inconclusive, noted disturbing changes in Death Guard battlefield tactics, including increased use of chemical and biological weapons against civilian targets. The Emperor implemented countermeasures against these emerging threats with characteristic thoroughness. He expanded the authority of the Council of Terra to include oversight of Legion deployments, creating administrative checks that would flag unusual operational patterns. The Mechanicum received enhanced screening protocols for equipment and personnel returning from extended Crusade operations. Most significantly, the Emperor reinforced the psychic wards throughout the Sol system, establishing layered defenses that would detect and contain warp contamination before it could reach Terra itself. These precautions, while prudent, proved insufficient against the most devastating blow to the Emperor's plans, one that came not from enemies, but from the misguided loyalty of his most psychically gifted son. Magnus the Red, observing events from distant Prospero through his formidable psychic abilities, discovered Horus's corruption and the War Master's plans for rebellion. Desperate to warn his father, Magnus gathered his power and projected his consciousness across the galaxy, bypassing conventional communication channels in his urgency to deliver this critical intelligence. The consequences proved catastrophic. Magnus's psychic sending, powered by unprecedented desperation, tore through the Emperor's carefully constructed psychic barriers around the palace. Worse, it breached the delicate webway sections the Emperor had been stabilizing, creating a massive rupture in the barriers between real space, the webway, and the immaterium. Demonic entities immediately poured through this breach, threatening to establish a permanent warp rift in the heart of Terra itself. The Emperor's reaction was immediate and decisive. He abandoned all other concerns to contain this existential threat, directing his full psychic might against the webway breach. The effort required to hold back the immaterium was immense, forcing the Emperor to remain seated upon the Golden Throne for extended periods. His consciousness split between maintaining the physical barriers and battling the entities attempting to push through. This sudden crisis transformed the Golden Throne from a control mechanism into a containment device, with the Emperor as its prisoner. In the brief moments between containment sessions, the Emperor received Magnus's warning about Horus's betrayal. The information, while critical, arrived too late to prevent the damage to the Webway project, and at too high a cost. The Emperor's response combined cold strategic assessment with profound disappointment. He dispatched Leman Russ and the Space Wolves to bring Magnus to Terra, intending to question the Crimson King directly about his disastrous psychic sending and the events he had witnessed concerning Horus. The Emperor's orders to Russ were precise: apprehend Magnus and return him to Terra for judgment. What the Emperor failed to anticipate was Horus's interference in this command chain. The corrupted War Master, now actively working to undermine Imperial authority, modified these orders as they passed through his command structure, transforming them from arrest to execution. This manipulation exemplified how thoroughly chaos had compromised Imperial communication systems, allowing Horus to twist the Emperor's intentions into actions that further served the ruinous powers. The resulting devastation of Prospero eliminated one of the Emperor's most powerful potential allies against the coming storm. Magnus, believing himself betrayed by his father, made a desperate pact with the chaos entity Tzinch to save his remaining sons. This final fall of the Thousand Sons represented a strategic disaster for the Emperor, one of his most capable legions transformed from asset to enemy through a cascade of misunderstandings and manipulations. As reports of open rebellion began reaching Terra, the Emperor found himself in an unprecedented strategic predicament. The Webway breach required his constant attention to prevent a warp rift from opening on Terra, yet the growing heresy demanded leadership only he could provide. This impossible dilemma forced the Emperor to delegate military authority to those sons who remained loyal, primarily Rogel Dorn and Malkador, while he maintained the psychic barriers that protected humanity's homeworld from demonic incursion. The emperor directed Dorn to transform the imperial palace from administrative center to fortress. The Praetorian implemented these orders with characteristic efficiency, converting ornate structures into hardened bunkers and establishing layered defensive positions throughout the palace complex. Civilian populations were evacuated from areas designated as potential battlegrounds, while strategic resources were stockpiled in secured vaults deep beneath the palace foundations. These preparations, conducted with cold pragmatism, acknowledged the unthinkable, that Terra itself might face direct assault from traitor forces. Simultaneously, the emperor worked with Malcador to reorganize imperial command structures for civil war. Astropathic choirs received enhanced security protocols to prevent interception or corruption of messages. Supply lines were rerouted to avoid sectors showing signs of wavering loyalty. The emperor ordered the establishment of secondary command centers throughout the Sol system, ensuring that even if Terra itself fell, imperial resistance could continue under designated successors. The emperor's strategic preparations extended beyond conventional military considerations to address the unique threats posed by chaos-corrupted Astartes. He authorized the expansion of the Silent Sisterhood's authority, granting them operational independence to target suspected chaos influence wherever it appeared. The Mechanicum received specialized technical specifications for weapons effective against traitor Astartes, including enhanced versions of the Volkite weapons that could overcome even Legion's Astartes physiology. Most significantly, the Emperor directed the Custodian Guard to prepare for the unthinkable, the potential corruption of any Imperial force, including those legions still considered loyal. Specialized training protocols were implemented, focusing on techniques effective against Astartes' opponents. The Emperor personally provided Constantin Valdor with contingency instructions for worst-case scenarios, including the potential loss of Terra or the Emperor himself. These preparations reflected the master of mankind's unflinching realism about the challenges ahead. Throughout these strategic adjustments, the Emperor maintained his position on the Golden Throne, his immense psychic power the only barrier preventing demonic legions from pouring through the webway breach onto Terra. This constant exertion took a measurable toll even on his transhuman physiology. Custodians assigned to the throne room reported brief moments when the Emperor's physical form showed signs of strain, golden light occasionally dimming, minute tremors in otherwise perfectly controlled limbs, momentary fluctuations in the psychic aura that perpetually surrounded him. The Emperor permitted himself only the briefest respites from this vigil, using these moments to provide critical guidance to his remaining loyal servants. During one such interval, he summoned Malcador and Dorn to the inner sanctum, where he outlined the theoretical possibility of using the Golden Throne as a life support mechanism if circumstances required it. This contingency planning revealed that the Emperor had calculated all possible outcomes of the coming conflict, including scenarios where his physical form might be compromised, while his consciousness remained necessary for humanity's survival. As the heresy spread across the galaxy, consuming world after world in brutal compliance actions, the Emperor's focus remained divided between immediate containment of the webway breach and long-term planning for humanity's survival. He directed Malcador to identify and secure individuals with specific genetic or psychic markers that might prove valuable in future restoration efforts. Certain gene vaults within the palace received additional protection, their contents deemed essential for potential recovery operations after the current crisis. The Emperor's apparent detachment during this period has been misinterpreted by later imperial scholars as indifference to human suffering. In reality, his perspective encompassed threats beyond the comprehension of even his transhuman sons. The webway breach represented not merely a tactical setback, but an existential danger to the species itself. If the Emperor had abandoned his position on the Golden Throne to directly confront Horus, Terra would have fallen not to traitor Astartes, but to endless demonic legions pouring through an uncontained warp rift at the heart of the palace. This necessary division of attention created tragic consequences that would haunt the Imperium for millennia. The emperor's reduced communication with his loyal sons left them without the full context of his decisions, forcing them to execute defensive strategies without understanding the complete strategic picture. Primarchs like Guilliman, coordinating resistance in distant sectors, received only fragmentary guidance through increasingly unreliable astropathic channels. Even Dorn, present on Terra, found himself implementing defensive preparations. Without fully comprehending the psychic battle the Emperor waged simultaneously beneath the palace. The most profound tragedy of this period lay in the Emperor's inability to directly address the human needs of his Primarch sons, needs he had perhaps never fully acknowledged in his design of these transhuman generals. Created as weapons first and sons second, the Primarchs nevertheless developed complex emotional requirements that the Emperor's grand vision had not adequately accommodated. In the crucible of betrayal that the heresy represented, this oversight proved catastrophic. Horus, once the most favored son, had turned against his father not merely through chaos corruption, but through a complex mixture of perceived abandonment, wounded pride, and genuine concern that the Emperor's plans would destroy rather than elevate humanity. The Warmaster's fall represented not just a tactical setback, but a fundamental failure in the relationship between creator and creation, a failure the Emperor recognized but could not address while maintaining the psychic barriers protecting Terra. As the traitor forces pushed toward the Sol system, the Emperor prepared for the inevitable final confrontation. He worked with the few remaining Mechanicum adepts he trusted completely to modify his personal wargear, incorporating arcane technologies effective against warp-corrupted opponents. The Emperor's armor received additional psychic wards designed specifically to counter the chaos powers now enhancing Horus. His sword, already a masterpiece of both physical and psychic engineering, was further enhanced to sever not just physical bodies, but the connections between corrupted souls and their chaos patrons. The Emperor harbored no illusions about the coming battle. His psychic foresight, while deliberately limited to avoid attracting the attention of the ruinous powers, provided glimpses of potential outcomes, most of them catastrophic for humanity. Yet he also perceived narrow paths leading to survival, slender possibilities, where humanity might endure even if the Imperium as he had envisioned it did not. The Emperor's preparations focused on securing these potential futures, even at the cost of his original vision. In his final strategic assessment before Horus's forces reached Terra, the Emperor calculated that conventional victory was no longer possible. The Webway project lay in ruins, its promise of safe interstellar travel without warp exposure now unattainable for millennia, if ever. The Imperial truth had failed as a protective measure against chaos, with belief in the supernatural resurging throughout human space. Most significantly, the Primarchs, his greatest creations and intended guardians of humanity, had been divided, with half turned against their original purpose. Yet the Emperor refused to abandon humanity to the predations of chaos. If his original vision could not be realized, he would implement contingency plans developed over millennia of strategic foresight. The Imperium that would emerge from the heresy might bear little resemblance to what he had intended, but it would provide humanity with the structure needed to survive in a galaxy more hostile than even he had anticipated. The Emperor prepared himself for the sacrifices this alternative path would require, including the possible loss of his active leadership. As the traitor Legion's fleet appeared at the edges of the Sol system, the Emperor made his final preparations. He provided Malkador with specific instructions for various contingencies, including protocols for the Sigillite to temporarily take his place on the Golden Throne if necessary. The Emperor entrusted certain artifacts of immense power to the Custodian Guard, with instructions for their use or destruction depending on how events unfolded. Most significantly, he completed modifications to the Golden Throne that would allow it to sustain his consciousness, even if his physical form suffered catastrophic damage. The shadow of heresy had fallen across the Emperor's grand design, forcing him to abandon his original vision for humanity's evolution. The Webway project, intended to free mankind from dependence on warp travel, lay in ruins. The secular imperial truth had failed to protect humanity from chaos corruption. Half his Primarch sons had turned against him, leading their legions in rebellion rather than conquest. Yet even in this darkest hour, the Emperor maintained his fundamental commitment to humanity's survival. As Horus's fleet engaged the outer defenses of the Sol system, beginning the solar war that would culminate in the Siege of Terra, the Emperor prepared for a confrontation that would reshape the galaxy. The Master of Mankind, creator of the Primarchs and architect of humanity's potential ascension, faced the consequences of his most human miscalculation, the failure to understand that even his transhuman sons required more than purpose and power. They needed the connection, recognition, and understanding that he, in his godlike detachment, had never fully provided. This fundamental oversight would cost the Emperor his dream of personally guiding humanity to evolutionary transcendence, transforming him from active leader to symbolic figurehead of an imperium very different from what he had intended, a transformation that would begin with the ultimate confrontation between father and favored son aboard the vengeful Spirit.